will be coming out to you to give you opportunities not just to put questions to our panels, but also to contribute your thoughts and ideas. A couple of housekeeping notes before I introduce our host for the day. I'd like to welcome those watching via live web streaming and to mention the Twitter hashtag. It's actually the same hashtag that's being used for the S&D Social Europe campaign that was launched last week. I think you'll hear more about that in a moment. The hashtag social rights. And Livia, where is she, will be monitoring the Twitter sphere. So if you're shy and you don't want to put up your hand, but you would like to ask a question, you can do it via Twitter, and Livia will tell me about it later on. Languages. German is on channel 1, English on 2, French is on 3, Italian is on 4, and Spanish is on 8. So now, without further ado, it's my great pleasure to give the floor to our host today, Udo Bullmann, MEP, who is the S&D Group Vice President, responsible for the economic and social model, to formally open proceedings. Udo, over to you.
Many thanks, Jackie, and a warm welcome to all our distinguished guests, to the experts, to those who have helped to so excellently organize this meeting of today. One additional housekeeping information. You have already seen that once Jackie is moderating a meeting like this, you never are in danger to fall asleep. But if you feel like that, there's some coffee, so you can help yourself. But serious enough is the issue we are tackling today, referring to a core idea of the traditional labor movement, to a core idea of our Social Democratic Party, of our socialists and Democrats all over the world. People are not enemies if they come from different countries. And let me underline this especially today, in times like that, where right-wing populists, where new fascists try to spread hatred and try to create new ideological wars, which often enough in our history have ended up in real wars, in cruelty. If people, whether they are migrants, whether they are refugees, come to our countries, come to Europe, we regard them as friends. If so, as refugees, then as victims. But coming to us, giving them the chance to integrate into our societies, we regard them as enrichment, as assets for our forthcoming development, not as a threat. This is our basic understanding where we come from. And all the rest is more or less an elaboration on this basic idea. With us today is Brando Benifei, our good colleague from the Employment Committee, and much of this seminar is based on his work. He did an excellent report where he dealt with the equal treatment and the rights for migrant workers, clarifying that we do not accept special working relations, that we do not accept discriminating practices for those who are new in our countries. Quite the opposite. We want to have offensive schemes of qualifications and skills. We want to have easy access to languages and professional skills. We want to have an adequate funding which enables the newcomers to fully integrate into our societies, into our labor markets. And we want to see European proposals from the European Commission that encourage member states to engage in this subject. Today, a lot of that is shamefully blocked by the Council, by member states, who too easily fall victim to right-wing propagandists. You know what we are talking about. We have developments, especially in Hungary and elsewhere, which are totally frightening. But not only there, also in other countries, we can see that right-wing populists try to make profit of the fact that we have people with different original languages, with different cultures, with different heritage. But wherever you go to in history, it was always the overlap of different cultural roots, of different beliefs, of different understandings of society, which enriched the relevant formations of humankind. All those entities, all those territories in which we had a liberal handwriting of mutually supportive practices, of political and ideological acceptance and tolerance, of mutually supportive schemes to enable newcomers to integrate, to fully integrate, we very soon saw the blessings coming back to these kind of societies. And always in those regions and in those areas where people were motivated by ideologies to fight each other and to hate each other, the end was a disaster. So let us learn from history. Let us learn from our own internationalism, from our own heritage, that we do not give up in this fight, and that we build on the excellent work of Brando and other colleagues to organize real progress. We expect from the Commission a strong European pillar of social rights. This strong pillar of social rights should be open not only traditionally for the members of society which have a long-standing citizenship, but also for the newcomers. We will campaign for that. We will advocate a well-managed migration and integration of people who will come to us, and I wish you the utmost success for the seminar and lots of good chances to exchange your views. Please come back to us with your comments, with all your ideas, and today is not the last day that we meet up on this occasion and on this subject. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much indeed, Udo. Ladies and gentlemen, Udo Bullmann, and thank you for having us here today and for focusing on this very important issue, as you say, could not be more timely in light of some of the proposals coming out of the European Commission at the moment and the discussion around many of those issues. We're going to divide this into two panel discussions this afternoon, and in each case they'll be introduced by a member of the European Parliament, and then we will hear from our panelists, and then I will come out to all of you. So, as Udo said, assets, not threats. How do we ensure that Europe makes the most of those assets and enables those assets, those peoples, to be fully integrated? What are the broader challenges and success factors for integration? That is what we want to focus on in our first panel. And then we will consider this in the context of how do you ensure equal treatment for all workers, and what are the special needs of migrants, of refugees. So broadly, that is what we're going to discuss. I see our panel are assembling as we speak. So let me introduce them. You've already heard him mentioned, Brando Benifei, MEP, who's a member of the Parliament's Employment and Social Affairs Committee and rapporteur for the S&D Group on the Labour migration files. Lovely to see you, Brando. Richard Holowinski, who is Migration Policy Specialist at the ILO. A very warm welcome to you, Richard. Clara Forti, Research Manager at the European Foundation for the Improvement of Living and Working Conditions, better known as Eurofound. And last but not least, Abdelbasit Al-Hishan, who is a Syrian refugee now living in Belgium and doing a great deal of voluntary work at the moment with others in his situation. I think, Abdel, you came at the end of 2015, you said, from Damascus. via Greece. Thank you so much for being with us. We look forward to hearing your experiences and your reaction and what you think needs to be done and how you see the challenges in this area. But we're going to start with an introduction to this session by Brando, just to give us some context for our discussion, and then I'll invite other panelists to give me some opening thoughts, and then we'll jump in. Brando, please.
Thank you, Jackie, dear guests, panelists, and colleagues. It's a real pleasure to be here today and to have the possibility to discuss openly, frankly, about one of the issues that can truly be understood as a cornerstone of the European Union, the labor mobility, or we can say in general, the mobility of workers in the European Union. First of all, please allow me also to thank our organizers in the group of the Socialists and Democrats for their excellent work, all the guests and speakers who accepted our invitation today, and obviously our interpreters. Labor mobility is at the same time a very broad topic, but also a very specific one. To a greater extent, it presents a complexity on its own because it comprehends a broad range of issues which encompasses and overlaps with both the field of economics and with fundamental rights issues, with labor market policy, but also migration policy. It has endless ramifications in many fields, for example, in the field of social inclusion, equal treatment provisions, intercultural exchange, skills and professional qualifications, recognition of diplomas, and so on and so forth. I've seen it very clearly in my work on the report that also Udo has mentioned, the report on the integration of refugees in the labor market that was approved last July in the European Parliament. Why are all these matters so topical right now, often receiving so much public and media attention? Unfortunately, way too often a negative, pushed by populist and xenophobic rhetoric. I would say for the presence of three reasons. Well, actually, these reasons are, in fact, the three crises that we have been facing in the past years. The economic and unemployment crisis, the migration crisis, and the political crisis of the EU and its project. The coexistence of the negative protracted outcomes of each of these traumatic situations for the European Union, for its citizens, and for the people who came to Europe, often in desperate situation in need of help, bring to the surface a series of contradictions. These are the contradictions of an unfinished political, institutional, and economic experiment called in our treaties the European Union, which, like every experiment, could still fail also because of the inability to tackle this issue of a fair mobility in a broader sense. So to conclude, today is the time for reverting this trend, to keep a cool mind and try to unlock at its fullest the potential that labor migration can provide for our societies. We need to make a change, we need to make reforms, we need to be ambitious, forward-looking. I'm sure that we will go into the details today also of the discussion, also the legislative files that are being discussed, and we need to be quick in doing all of this because people want answers from us, both people coming and the people in the reception countries. So I'm looking forward to exchange views and debate with you all today, and so thank you again for all that are here today with us.
Thank you very much indeed, Brando. And as you say, such a complex topic with so many factors feeding into it. How do we make sure that we get the joined up thinking in this area to bring those together to provide effective responses, and underlining there how important this issue, the broad issue of fair mobility, is for the future of the European Union, finding those answers. Let's get some perspectives from our other panelists first, and then I'll have a few questions for them, and then we'll open up to the floor. Richard, from your perspective, new realities and new challenges. How do you see that new reality, and what for you are the central challenges?
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation, as well as to the ILO, to be present here. With regard to the realities, I think, there is a very much a stark choice facing Europeans. I mean, if you can call it a choice when it comes to migration policies. They can choose more open and diverse societies, which recognize that migrants and refugees have an important role to play in building the future prosperity of this continent through rejuvenating workforces at all skill levels and contributing to sustainable development. And this is, in fact, at the global level, what is recognized in the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. Or, from a negative perspective, they can choose to try to insulate themselves against the other through closing borders and erecting political and social barriers. So effectively viewing migrants and refugees as threats in terms of security and in economic terms. But closing borders is or cannot be the answer. According to ILO estimates, migration for employment is set to continue and grow. We estimated in 2015 that out of the 232 million migrants in 2013, 150 were migrating for employment, and just under half of these were women. And refugees also leave, while they leave their countries because of war, persecution, or conflict, they also eventually end up looking for employment. So that's one of the clear realities. Another reality is, of course, that if we're talking about formulating coherent and longer-term policies, we need to also recognize some genuine concerns of national population, which have been exacerbated by the points that Brando Benifei outlined in his opening remarks. So this requires a greater effort among government policymakers, parliamentarians, journalists, and other relevant stakeholders in society to engage in a robust and a balanced debate informed by facts and evidence. Now, as far as the ILO is concerned, the ILO, for those of you who are less familiar with it, the mandate of the ILO extends to all workers, so nationals, migrants, as well as refugees. The ILO is founded on the principles of social justice and that labor is not a commodity, and ensuring equal treatment for all workers is at the heart of ILO standards, particularly Conventions 97-143 addressing migrant workers, which have been ratified by a number of EU member states. And in our view, there are a number of key elements that have to be taken into account in designing fair migration policies in Europe. And let me just, let me just outline some quickly. The need to open up more regular labour mobility pathways for both migrants and refugees at all skill levels to meet labour market needs. Recognizing that early access to the labour market is vital for the successful integration of migrant workers and refugees generally, and also helps in reintegration in the country of origin if they return home. And here we have recently adopted guiding principles on access of refugees and other forcibly displaced persons to the labour market, which we feel is a useful tool which can help policymakers as well as EU policymakers, particularly in the context of the discussions on the asylum measures currently taking place. Another important area is to support labour market inclusion with specific schemes to recognise migrants and refugees' qualifications and skills. And here also the ILO is developing global guidance on recognition of the prior learning and skills and competencies of particularly low and medium skilled workers. And we think these could be useful for you as well. Facilitating a whole of government approach. Integration cannot just be the task of one ministry. When it comes to labour market integration, labour and employment ministries are important, as well as the principal actors in the world of work, workers and employers representatives. Avoiding social dumping or race to the bottom. And if one looks at some of the EU measures which are currently being negotiated and discussed at the moment, I think that they do need careful scrutiny to ensure that access to the labour market for migrants and refugees, as well as equal treatment, is respected. And finally, yes, yeah.
Now through the discussion, but a very brief final point, if you would. Sorry.
And a final point, clearly, in terms of fairer migration policies, is to establish solidarity and genuine cooperation with countries outside of Europe, genuine cooperation. So partnerships with origin countries of migrant workers, as well as shared responsibility and solidarity with those countries in the vicinity of Europe that are hosting large populations of refugees.
Okay. Thank you very much, and sorry for bringing you to a close, but you're raising so many issues, and I want to have time to discuss them all with our panel and with the room. But thank you, there, very clear enumeration of the areas we need to focus on. Clara Foti, from your perspective, how do you see the new reality, and would you underline the same challenges that Brando and Richard have spoken about, or are there other areas you would also highlight?
Yes, perhaps I could tell you, I basically agree with what was said before, but I just want to highlight some key points from the conclusion of our report, which is approaches to the labor market of integration, labor market integration of
copies
refugees.
Here?
Yes, there
Super.
are some copies
Thank
there.
you.
And we published that mid-December 2016, so just last year, and we collected data and information from our correspondents from the 28 EU member states, and perhaps now let me highlight some of the key points, some of the conclusions of our main conclusions of our report. Although the report focused on labor market integration within this context, it also examined access to social services, mainly reception conditions and other support measures. And one of the main conclusions we drew, is that living conditions in reception centers are often inadequate to prepare people for employment. The main problems reported were overcrowding and poor conditions and lack of proper accommodation. Availability of externally provided services, such important ones as, for example, health or education, poses another challenge, and coordination with these services proved difficult. Due to housing shortages in the key destinations countries, even in Sweden, when geographical distribution of asylum seekers and refugees are, when this geographical distribution is planned, proximity of jobs cannot always be taken into account. In many countries, the average duration of the asylum procedure increased, but in order to ease the effects of the delays in obtaining a decision, various measures have been introduced, or in some cases, the procedure has been accelerated for specific groups of asylum seekers. For example, in Germany, those specific measures were introduced, those asylum seekers who have high chances of staying in the country. In a number of countries, the granting of asylum has recently become temporary. This provision, temporariness, can weaken asylum seekers' position in the labor market, since it may deter employers from hiring them or offering them long-term contracts or investing in training for them. And the final point I want to make, that some countries have recently reduced some non-employment related social services and allowances for refugees and asylum seekers, or both, arguing often that this would increase their motivation to work. But we have to see clearly that decreased income social services could, however, kind of backfire, because they could further impede labor market integration, since it affects their living conditions, and living conditions obviously very important prerequisites for a proper labor market integration. Restrictions on family reunification, we know about those, may have a similar impact, further postponing social and labor market inclusion of refugees and asylum seekers. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. So, very interesting finding there, and highlighting some of those key issues that we need to come back to in our discussion. How do we respond? But Abdul, perhaps if you could tell us a little bit more about your story, just to start with, how you came here, and then how you see, listening to the rest of the panel, and your experiences with your own attempts to get into the labour market, and indeed the voluntary work that you are doing, how you see the challenge at the moment, not the solutions, we'll come back to the solutions, but what are the obstacles that you and others are facing?
First, I would like to thank you for this invitation, and I'm so happy to be here to tell a little bit of my experience. I've been here in Belgium for 1 year, and I took the way from the second way, not the first way through Hungary. I took it from Greece to Serbia, Macedonia, Croatia, Slovenia, Austria, Germany, and here. And since I came here, I'm trying to engage in so many things. First, because I speak good English, but from my personal experience, I think that the most big obstacle that we have it here, first is the language, because most, if I may say, maybe 75 or 80% of the people, they are coming from conflict zone like Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan. They don't have the capacity of language, it's very big leap that they have to take it, because I'm going to start to comment on what you said about the labor market. If you want to go into labor market and you don't have your papers yet, the people who want you to work for them, they will not invest in you, because maybe in 2 months, 3 months, you will get your papers and they will send you back. So why should I invest in you and then you will leave in 2 or 3 or 4 months? Here in Belgium, it's a little bit faster than the other countries to get your positive papers. For example, in Sweden, you have to wait for maybe 1.5 years. In Germany, 2 years. In some other European countries, it depends on your situation or the place that you came from. One more thing, it's about you got your papers and now you have to go into the labor market. Like here, if I may say, if you want to decide about refugees, but I can't see any refugee here. So my point is to engage the refugees, to engage the migrants more than to ask them, to communicate with them and to see what is good for them and what is good for European country, as I'm not talking about Belgium or Denmark or any country, because after all, it's all about working together to make this place a better place. I've been doing a lot of volunteer work because I can't find a paid job, like a daily job from 9 to 5 or something like this. So through this voluntary job, I'm here now. And I'm trying to help as much as I can with voluntary jobs. And I want to say something, it makes me feel so bad actually, that in our East culture, we don't have voluntary jobs, or we don't have this perspective of volunteers job. Because the wages that you take it's too low, so you have to think about your food, and you have to make living for your family, for your children, and you have to work. When I was in Syria, I used to work from 7 o'clock till 11 o'clock every day, no holiday at all. And that's the concept of the voluntary work. For some people here in Europe, they don't have it. I'm talking about the people, they are from another countries. Like I said, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, because I used to live in a centrum in Flanders, in a small village, it's called Scherbenheuvel. And those 3 nationalities, they were from Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. And the people, they were trying to engage us in voluntary works, but because of our bad experience, this is voluntary jobs, okay, so it will be money, they will be money at the end of it. So that I'm trying to now to focus on this thing, to engage people in this, because most of the Middle East, it's a dictatorships, and you know
so we have as well as, I mean, it's very striking what you're saying, because you talked about the importance of early access to labour markets, and of course one of the proposals, reception's condition, to bring down the time when you can. But as you say, if you don't have your final papers, you have yours now? You've got yours now. How long did that take?
9 months.
9 months.
After 9 months, they send.
If you haven't got them at all, then even if theoretically you have access to the labour market, employers aren't interested. Very practical things, and then those differences of culture, which
of culture, it's very important. Very important, and because we came from a different religion, different culture, different habits, so many different languages. So it's like you come it's a very strange and very weird situation. Suddenly you were in Syria, and 2 days or a few days later, you are in a different thing. You can't deal with for example, the heating system, if I may say it. Here, it's totally different.
Well, you probably didn't need one that much.
Exactly,
as you need it
because
here.
you know
exactly.
that
Looking at out there today. So lots of issues there to come back on. Very struck by what you said about you must engage, don't make policies for migrants, for refugees, make them with them. And we'll come back to how we actually do that. But can I come back to this very broad point that Brando and Richard and indeed Udo in his opening remarks made about we need people like Abdul. However they came, we need them, our economy needs them, we know we need them. And yet, because of the febrile nature of the debate in many countries, because of the rise of populism, it's very hard to have a calm, rational debate about how to integrate them most effectively into the labour market and make integration a success. How can we, just to put this on the table first, Brando, how can we square that circle? Is there a way of turning this debate round so that we begin to talk about these assets? Sorry, it makes you sound like a thing, but I'm using the word that Udo used. These assets and this distinction people make between humanitarian and economic migrants. This is a humanitarian migrant who will have an economic benefit. Is it a valid distinction? Brando?
Well, there is a lot of confusion, in fact, because many people in Europe confuse humanitarian migrants with economic migrants. Also because there are, in fact, often cases of people who propose themselves as humanitarian migrants and, in fact, are economic migrants. So they generalize these examples that are, in their own way, due to the fact that the economic migration channels are not there. We have a problem of creating enough legal economic migration channels so that people who want to migrate for those reasons don't use the humanitarian channels in a wrong way, so that screw up the general image of the humanitarian channels. So it's first of all a crisis of policy, of the fact that we don't have the instruments. I've been dealing with the blue card now and with the reception conditions and qualifications directive. On all of them I have parliamentary responsibility, so I have a clear view of the thing. We need to intervene both on the humanitarian side and the economic migration side, and to have clear, rational, as you said, well-organized channels at EU level. In fact, on the blue card, our effort now is to make it a real, legal, highly skilled labor migration instrument that is a real EU instrument, overcoming, substituting, maintaining flexibility, but substituting the national schemes. But this is difficult because we must mention the big thing that is behind all of this. It's the crisis, social and economic, that hinders the ability of the people that are already living in the countries that receive these new people to confront with these issues in a rational way. They don't do it because simply they feel very often that resources that we devote to integration of these people, of these new people, and this is an investment on the future, they feel that this money is taken away from them, from their own needs, from their own problems, for their own vulnerabilities, which can be because they are long-term unemployed, because they are disabled people, because they are coming from marginalized communities. So it's crucial, and I did it I insisted a lot when I worked on the report on the integration of refugees on the issue of where do we get the money to do this. Because if people feel that we invest on all this that is needed, we have to be strong on this. It's an investment on the future. But if we do this using resources that people feel should be used for them, for the people already in Europe, we will not get any social support. So we need to understand that we need additional resources that support migration of labor and support the integration of people when they get here, both humanitarian migrants and the economic migrants that need to find new legal migration channels.
Okay. Which is why you said at the beginning that for you the problem was this crisis upon crisis that has created an atmosphere in which this debate is very difficult to have in a rational way. Richard, you talked about legal channels for migration. You talked about all skills levels. Brando has mentioned there, and I hope we can come back to it, the blue card and the attempts to make it. Hasn't really worked so far, not really taken off. Why not? But let's come back to that. But you talked about all skills levels, the low and the medium skilled as well. For you, is that the key to unlocking this endless debate about economic migrants versus humanitarian migrants and the confusion and conflating of the two? How can we change that debate?
Thank you for that question. You know, I did stress one of my first points about, as you've mentioned, opening up more mobility at all skill levels from outside of the European Union. And that, I think, is clearly a need to recognize what the labour market needs are. And I'm not sure whether the European Union yet has developed a clear policy in this direction, or individual member states with regards to assessing their labour market needs in respect of the need for migrant workers or refugee workers, as the case may be, at all skill levels. We know, for example, you know, in the context of ILO's work, you know, in 2011, the International Labour Conference adopted a very important convention on the protection, essentially, of the rights of domestic workers. And we know many domestic workers are migrants, particularly in Europe and other parts of the world. And in fact, our global estimates, which are outside the room, have a special focus also on migrant domestic workers. This is an occupation for which there clearly is a need in the context of Europe's aging population, the need for more women to enter the labour market, etc. That need is clearly there, but it's not. This is one of the skill needs that's not very clearly recognised in national migration policies, let alone EU policy. We have a directive on seasonal workers, which meet some of those needs to a certain extent. And it's sort of variable geometry in Europe when it comes to the need for lower skilled migrants. Some countries will tell you that we can satisfy those needs from within the European Union. Others clearly are satisfying those needs from outside of the European Union, particularly the countries in southern Europe. So there is still quite a lot to be done. And of course, these are the workers that are considered by many national populations to be a threat to their jobs, even though the evidence is fairly nominal. They have a very nominal impact in terms of wages, working conditions. Of course, if they move in an irregular way, enter the informal market, that affects the conditions
but if
of
we
all
don't
workers.
have the facts, if we don't know precisely what the needs are, we can't counter that argument, that perception of threat. So we have a crisis of policy and we have a crisis of diagnosis analysis at the same time. And if you put those together, it is helping to create this atmosphere in which a rational, sensible debate about the way forward can't happen. Clara, would you agree with that? And what do you see as the key? How much do we know from your perspective about what facts do we have that could change or reframe that debate? Do you see any hope for reframing the debate at this stage?
You mean the debate between humanitarian migrants
And economic, and that this is such an issue where it becomes so heated, it's very difficult to then focus on the issues we want to focus on today about practically how do you make this a success for Abdul and for others and for Europe? How do we all gain? Because as Abdul said, it's for the benefit of the whole of society. Do you see a way of getting to that discussion?
I mean, again, what was already said before, I can just really reiterate that labor market, access to labor market and early access to labor market is really key. And then, of course, the humanitarian migrants could become so-called economic migrants, because then they can also fulfill, those roles, those labor shortages which the host countries have. But of course, for that, much investment is needed from the part of the host country. And as Abdullah said, really we need to invest in a way that migrants' needs are heard. And they also, their skills are assessed in a proper way. And then, of course, all kind of, the procedure of language learning and combined with skill assessment, combined with their prior learning experience and prior work experience, on that basis, they could be integrated into the labor market, perhaps.
Because presumably many also don't necessarily have the paperwork relating to their qualifications or whatever in the midst of what they have been through to get here.
Yeah.
They may have the skills, they may have the experience, but they can't prove their formal qualifications. Yeah. How much of an issue is that in terms of them finding themselves in jobs for which they are vastly overskilled? So we're not making the most of our assets.
True, and I think that we should be kind of quite honest about that, and we have to make it clear that when we want to be realistic about labor market integration, perhaps because of the various disadvantages the refugees and the asylum seekers have at the beginning, when they actually arrive the country, when it comes to labor market integration, we have to honestly say, okay, perhaps they should be, if they want really labor market integration, perhaps they could be integrated first in a kind of low-skilled jobs, which, yes, they actually, it could mean a waste of human capital, a kind of a brain waste at the beginning, but at the same time making sure that actually their skills are, or their jobs are kind of upgraded according to their own skills.
Sure. Abdul, I don't know how much, whether you have had any help in this area in terms of that skills identification and that, so when you go to a potential employer, being able to, I don't know whether you have formal qualifications that you have the paperwork for that you can show them. You obviously have magnificent English, so as you say, you're way ahead of many others. But in terms of your skill set, has that been part of the way, when you arrived in Belgium, helping you to identify what you could do with your skill set, or has that really not been part of the equation?
No, actually, now I live in Belgium in Flanders, and they have some kind of institution called VDAP. And when you got your papers, you have to get your papers, and then you go to this institution, and you say, I used to study, for example, I study in Syria business management and the human resources. I have a bachelor in business management, and I used to work in logistic services. So you go to this institution and you say, I want to work on this field or in that field, and you make your profile, and I'm talking about what I'm doing personally. I keep sending emails to this company or that company or this or this or that. I can't go on the street and I say, do you need a worker or something like this. Also here in Belgium, there's something called a student job. You can work it if you are a student, but and the taxes, it's so low. And that's why most of the people, they are trying to work, to hire the people as a student job, because they don't have to pay that much taxes. But for me, I can't work as a student job because I'm too old. I'm 36, so I can't do it as a student job. So it's from both ways, from the people in the labor market and the people that they want to make policy for this. In Belgium, there's a very good law, actually, that if you are here in Belgium, after 4 months, you can work, even if you didn't get your papers, which I find it's very, very nice thing. So you can integrate more, even if you got negative. At least maybe you could you could save some money, or you could gain some experience. For example, let's say about a Syrian guy. No, Syrian we can't go back. For example, Iraqi or Afghanian guy, he got negative, and after 1 year, and he was working for 6 or 7 months, and he went back to his country with this experience from a first world, and he went back to. He would be so helpful in his society. even if he got negative, he can make some kind of advantage of it.
So this proposal in the Reception Conditions Directive to reduce the maximum time from 9 to 6 months, and you're saying 4 even better, absolutely crucial. But then I'm also wondering, from what you said earlier, whether we also need some new incentives for employers to say, if someone is now legally allowed to find a job but doesn't yet have permanent documentation, are there new incentives, ways we could to encourage them, because of the point you raised earlier about the worry, why should I invest in someone who might disappear?
Exactly. I can't invest in someone and then he will get. So even for law skills, so for people that they are still on the procedure, I think that we suggest to focus on the law skills. I'm not, for example, I study business management. I'm not going to work as a manager of company. I can go to work in a law skill for cleaning, for gardening, for anything during this period of time. And then after this time, if I got my papers, so I don't need to invest, even the government, if invest in me, and I went back, they are losing some money because they invest me for 2, 3, 4 months, and then I have to go back. Even the government itself, I'm not talking about the private sector, I'm talking about the government itself, okay, because say there's some kind of institution, government institution, you can go and you can have some trains in this institution. So if you got this training and you went back to your country, it will be a loss for the government. So we can start with the law skills job for everybody, even if he was a doctor, even if he was any kind of study, we can start with a law skills.
Okay, but then that raises the question of social dumping, and how do we make sure that the result, and Brando, question to you on this issue, how do we make sure that in saying, okay, that's a way in, that's at least a way to get a job, to get started, but how do we prevent that turns into social dumping, and that the long term, these people are trapped, not doing jobs that doing jobs they're very overqualified for. We're not making the best of these assets, as Udo put it, and we are now having a dumbing down and a lowering of standards generally. How do we square that circle? Because it's a difficult one, isn't it? We want to get them in, but we may give away ground that we shouldn't be, and principles that are very important when we talk about equal treatment.
Well, this is a huge issue. We see that, in fact, it's not only regarding in the debate of today, this specific labor mobility of people coming from outside the European Union, but it's in fact inflaming the whole debate inside the European Union. In fact, we are under a big discussion, for example, regarding the Posting of Workers Directive, the cleavages between West and East, North and South. So it's really a huge issue, and the labor migration of people out from outside the EU is in fact only a part of it. Well, I can say that the one way to make this work better in general is to push for convergence. So we need to strengthen this as a general policy indication. We have to strengthen the areas of the European Union where there are weaker opportunities, more inefficient labor markets, and we have to be, to prevent social dumping, we have to be very scientific in this sense. In my report it was said very clearly, not all the labor markets, not all the regions, exactly because there is still not enough convergence, are able to absorb the same number of people. That's why it was important, it was said also in the previous interventions, that we need to build really a system where people can move and we can be able to avoid concentration of people in some countries because there is a lack of solidarity, because there is a lack of a real holistic approach, because this is against our own interest. If we consider our interest as the European one and not just of the single country and the single region. But again, on this, sorry for being overly political, we need to be able to go over short-termism, which is looking after short terms in terms of elections. We need to be able to create a European Union that looks a little over 6 months. And to do this, the 25th of March, there will be this big discussion on the 60 years of the Treaty of Rome. We have seen that the European Commission has released the white paper. We need to get into that because we cannot solve this if we don't also create a system that incentivizes a little more long-term thinking among the policymakers and the institutions. And one last point on what we already are doing. It was well said by Udo in his opening remarks. We were very clear as S&D Group to reject the idea of, and we put it in the report that was approved by the European Parliament, the idea of creating secondary job markets for the refugees. We have to be very careful when we deal with volunteer work, when we deal about how to enlarge, for example, the scope of the blue card to lower skilled workers. These are very sensitive issues because we have to avoid the fact that European workers feel that they are having an unfair competition from people coming from outside. It's detrimental to people coming and to the people who are already here. So we have to be careful that there is no special exceptions. We can have programs, we can have voluntary work and on specific fields, on specific programs, but we have to be keeping all the time in mind that we have to avoid situations that can generate social tensions. We don't need that. Racism, intolerance can be challenged, can be won if we are able to create cohesive environments.
Which goes back to that word fair in fair mobility. If it is fair, and it is fair for everyone, then you can overcome some of these issues. I want to come back on some of the legislative files in more detail, but just a quick reaction, and Richard, on this point, you talked at the beginning about the need for a coherent long-term policy. Now, we have been in something of a crisis emergency response situation, given the influx of the last couple of years, but what do you see as the key to getting there? A thought on that, and then I'll come out to all of you, and then perhaps we'll delve into some of the more specific, the blue card and the reception conditions and so on.
Just two very quick points, and really just to follow up what Brando was saying with regard to the need really to avoid segmentation of the labour market, particularly when it comes to your refugees or indeed your migrant workers. And that is already a feature in many parts of Europe with regards to certain types of low-skilled work. I mentioned domestic work, also agriculture and so I would caution a little bit against the view that, okay, refugees can just start with low-skilled jobs. Yes, I can understand the thought or the need to, with respect to early access to the labour market, but there also needs to be upward mobility within the labour market, and the labour market institutions play a very important role here. Active labour market policies, role of employment services. There is still, we did a report at the ILO together with the Migration Policy Institute in Washington about the integration of newcomers into the labour market in a number of European Union countries. And one of the things that we found was the need for employment service, for example, to adjust and target this particular population group in order to assist in their upward mobility in the labour market. And as far as policies are concerned, and a long-term policy, I cannot agree more. There are some examples elsewhere in the world where there are such policies that sort of overcome, if you like, political differences that can change from election to election. Canada is a very good example of a country that says and has outright that they need so many, up to 250,000 people entering every year. This includes both permanent immigrants but also temporary workers, as well as a humanitarian channel. And that appears to have a lot of consensus in the population as a whole, regardless of the political differences that exist. I mean, that would be a model that I think the European Union could aspire to.
Clara, I don't know whether in any of your work or in your studies you have compared what is happening with Europe with other places, but how do you see the challenge in terms of moving to this more coherent, more holistic and longer term approach? What do we need to do?
Well, I think that actually, first of all, we really need a clear long-term vision, a long-term strategy. what are the phases of integration, perhaps. And also in this regard, there are such things which were actually found not only by ourselves, I mean by Eurofound, but also other research, that language learning, yes, it is actually very, very important. But again, refugees should not be stuck in training, but instead, they should also be, there should be access to work for them, and perhaps that kind of work where actually, so the language training should be in correspondence with the work they are supposed to do. So these are the very kind of small practical things which, if really adhered to and observed, then it could make a difference.
So match the language training to the skills and the likely
and the likely job.
Yeah.
Exactly, likely
I just wanted to ask you, Abdul, before I go out into the room, are you worried about, you talked about getting in at whatever level of skills to get into the job market and then working from there, but are you worried about this notion that you could get trapped in a low-skilled job or in training and find it very difficult to move your way out? So this balance that Brando was talking about, so that you can then move up and use the skills that you spent so long acquiring, or do you think that will happen organically, you just need to get your foot in the door?
I think, sorry, I think when you put your foot on the door, it's then your turn start. It's all about you. Of course, if I work here, if I get this level of skill and I stay in this place, of course, I'm not going to move on. And what I found it here actually in Europe itself, that you have the chance to go up and up in the company or in the work that you've been doing, because when it's not, I don't feel that I will be trapped like you are working in another place. So I think it will be a very opportunity when you put your foot on this place, and I think it will be a very good opportunity that you keep moving, and you will get ahead in your work. But only you have to do, only you have to find this first step, which is the most difficult step, to find it in the work here.
Thank you very much. Let's get any questions to our panel or comments, and then we can hopefully delve into the blue card in more detail and some of the other legislative files. Yes, please. Can I ask you, please, to introduce yourself and please be brief? Thank you, madam.
Oui, bonjour.
Good morning. I am an IT expert. I'm a European citizen and a physicist. And I don't have a European date when it comes to migrants who have lived in or worked in different countries. So we have that for each member state, but not at European level. And then often there is mistrust of migrants. It's absolutely true that citizens feel this mistrust, and it's very difficult to explain the situation to them. So I'm wondering whether we couldn't set up a specific fund for migrants, so a financial fund with money for migrants, and make that something separate to other social funds for citizens. And that way people won't feel this sense of mistrust. The second point that I would like to mention is a Belgian example. This is something that is done in Belgium to fight against illegal work. There is something called titre service, which are these vouchers used to pay people for work they do, and they can be used to pay migrants that do, for example, help with household chores, because it's usually mostly only migrants who do this domestic work. I use these vouchers. I'm very, very pleased. The state pays me for part of it. I pay per hour. the worker has insurance, and I just wanted to mention this as an example.
For people to give work to migrants, that's one of the ways that you can do it. And in terms of those funds, I mean, we do have the European Integration Fund. Is it enough? Do we need to look at this in a different way? Question for our panel. Other questions or comments to what you've heard? Yes, please.
Thank you, Lilana from PICUM. It's the Platform for Undocumented Migrants. I just wanted to pick up on the point that Richard from the ILO made about the clear demand for migrant workers in key sectors and the need for regular channels across skill levels. This is very much what we see as a network of organizations working with migrant workers who are working at the moment in the European Union in several sectors, in construction, in domestic work, in hotels, restaurants, manufacturing. There's clearly a need for these workers in these sectors. They're performing these jobs now. They're providing essential services to us on a daily basis. But what's not happening is their work being recognized, the demand being recognized. So really put that question back to the panel on what needs to be changing about the way that the European Union is doing its labour market needs assessment, that this isn't being captured, and really underlining the need that the reason why these workers are working irregularly is because there is no other option. And so we need regular channels and regularization for these people to be able to do their jobs in a safer way with better standards.
But you don't feel that that anecdotal knowledge that these are jobs that need to be filled is being translated into data and statistics that can be used to make policy, is that?
Yeah, there seems to be a big mismatch between the discussion on, focusing purely on the labour market needs in the blue card, highly qualified, and the reality that we work with on a daily basis. And the Seasonal Workers Directive only touches on a few of those, and it's also not being transposed yet. So let's see, that's another conversation. But just to really
thank you very much, Ilana. Thank you. Other questions or comments to our panel? Yes, please, sir.
My name is Dietmar Köster. I'm a member of the Liebe Committee, and I have a more general political question, perhaps more a contribution. I think one important question is in Europe how we can organize a more solidarity between the refugees, the migrants of the migrant workers, and the workers of the EU member states. And what can we do to achieve this? Because I think it is very important to organize a mood in the member states that they can accept that the government and the EU policy has the aim to integrate the refugees and the migrants. What are your proposals to achieve such a solidarity? Or do you have something in mind that we can overcome the situation that many workers in the EU member states are in favor of right populist party? And I think this is a very important point if we have to face the situation that we will have more worker migrants in the future.
Sure. Which goes back to Brando's point again about how do you make sure that whatever you're doing, you don't have a perception that if we invest in this, it's because we're taking away from that, which I think you underlined as how you see the central challenge there, but we'll get some comments to that in a moment. Any other questions or comments at this stage? Okay, let's come back. A slight diversity of questions, so please don't feel you have to pick up on all of it, but who would like to come in? We have this question really about funding mechanisms, and I would like a thought on that and how you see, I mean, EU funds can only be a part of the answer. It's not that big a pot, but how to use them most effectively. And do you think that would help overcome this mistrust issue of where the money's going? Low and medium-skilled workers, and perhaps, Brando, I can also ask you in the interest of time to touch on the Blue Card Directive and what you think the answer is. Why hasn't it really worked? And how are we going to make sure it does? And I know there's this huge question of salary thresholds, so I'd like a thought on that. And then that broader question about solidarity. Who would like to come in first? Brando? Yeah, sure.
we can say that there are many issues that have been put. What I can say is that on the funding issue, we had proposed to have some new funds that could be directly available for the organizations on the ground, because the best practices on integration we have seen, they come from organizations that actually operate on the ground, and it's not a system of top-down approach. We have seen, for example, on the usage of digital instruments, of apps and portals. We have seen some extremely effective examples, both in Germany and in Sweden, for example. On the other hand, on the distribution mechanisms, we have seen in Italy a best practice with the SPRAR system, which is not adopted by all the municipalities in Italy, but it has been a good example on how to avoid the fact that people that are coming are amassed in small areas and become, in fact, creating, there is a creation of ghettos and a situation of absolute no integration in the surrounding areas, by involving instead the local authorities, etc. We propose that in my report. That's very difficult politically. What is less politically difficult, instead of having an additional new fund, is to have a higher threshold inside the European, inside the cohesion funds on the European Social Fund, so that if we go on, as it seems, on the revision of the multi-annual financial framework inside the European institutions, this debate is still going on, we can increase the amount of social spending, so that even if we don't increase the total amount of money, we just choose to put more money there, so that we can avoid the situation where for example, case of Italy, the regional authorities have to choose to divert existing money from programs for other vulnerable groups to support integration measures. That is highly unpopular politically. That's also why I propose the new fund, because the European Commission, being outside the political fight on the smaller ground, it can propose to support the best practices. This is politically difficult, as well as those proposals that, for example, the government of Italy, again, it was Renzi's government, proposed of migration bonds. These are very sensitive issues, but we need to get into that, because if we don't have fresh resources, we are unable to convince people that we are doing an investment that is useful for everyone and not just for the people coming. The blue card is part of this. In the blue card case, it's not a matter of resources, it's more a matter of making the program accessible to people, because until now it has been too complicated to use. And there is this issue of the salary thresholds that you mentioned, that, well, we are still discussing in the parliament about that, but my opinion is that we need to maintain this instrument of flexibility, because we must avoid, again, the situation where we give the message that we, instead of investing in the people that are in need of being upskilled locally, we just import people from outside. The blue card needs to stay as an instrument for highly skilled people to come to cover shortages that we have.
But the shortages, one of the questions related to the shortages in low-skilled areas that we're not really identifying. We know it anecdotally, but we're not identifying it in terms of evidence.
I think
for
that
policy.
on the low-skilled side, we cannot promote a system where we cover these kind of shortages by bringing people from outside to compete on a low-skilled level. I think this is not the general approach we should have. I think it's very important, it has been said very clearly in the last intervention, that we need to support, and this again needs resources, national and European ones, for example, again from the European Social Fund, to support early intervention, language courses, access to the labor market. It's very important that in the proposals now from the European Commission, we lower the access limit from 9 months to 6 months. This was also my proposal in the report of the Parliament. We must go this way by to a higher quality employment. We cannot push for a competition on the low skill, because I think this will just bring people far from accepting this kind of rational, solidar, progressive, sustainable approach to labor migration.
So
we will just reinforce the ranks of the populist and of the extreme right if we don't approach this with care and attention on the specific issue of low-skilled, high-skilled divide.
Sure. Any reactions to that? Abdel, did you want to come in? I saw you reaching for your mic.
Like I said, what I think that we should work together to enter the labor market. For me, I find it actually it's too difficult to go into the labor market because of first the language, and second new environment for me, also new techniques, if I may say it, techniques how to find a job. It's totally different from our countries, and it's all about sharing, and it's all about communicating with us, and to communicate, because when you and also to be a little bit more strict from a government, because now some people, and that's why I find it for some people they have a bad or preconceived idea about the refugees or the immigrants. They came here to our country and they sit and they home. They are not working. They are not doing anything. And for some people, actually, personally, I find so maybe offensive to think about to think like that about us, because we didn't leave our country because we come here to take your jobs or to come to take your money, or for some people, I'm saying minority of the people here, and I had some kind of, if I may say, discrimination experience here because of the work, because of my color, because of my religion, and but the majority, they were very friendly with us. And because of this, I'm trying to make a communication all the time between, if I may say, if I may name it, the native people and the refugees. Yes, of course, there are some refugees, they are trying to take advantage of this system. They are not doing anything, they are trying. But of course, we are not all the same. But we came here because I am personally came from a war zone. I've lost everything. I've lost my job. I've lost my house. I've lost some of my family members. I've lost literally everything. And when I came here in Belgium, I had only 20 euro in my bucket from all the thing that I had it in Syria. And now I'm trying to be more engaged in the labor market, because I want to work also from, let me say, from religious point of view. We have so many verses in religion talks about you have to work, and you have to be very, very effective in the society, because this work, it will makes you a better person for yourself and for the community you live in it.
Thank you very much. Clara and Richard, in terms of some of these issues relating to the low and medium skills, and also 2 words, if you would, on the blue card, and where you stand on that, and whether you think the reform proposals will turn it into a more effective instrument, what the challenges have been, and then at the lower and medium skilled end, how do we square this circle? Clara first, and then Richard.
I think that, for example, I think that the direction where the European Commission goes in terms of, for example, the reception directive, the revision, the plans, I think are right. And that could also, I mean, I could just answer to you in this respect, that the number of undocumented migrants could be decreased as a result of getting or granting labor market access sooner to asylum seekers, because the problem is, as I said, that the asylum the procedure, of course, as a result of the large influx, has increased, but something to be done during the procedure.
Yes.
And if this, the procedure is further, I mean, the access is further, when they can have an access, the time further decreased, then again, the problem of undocumented migrants, then their number could be decreased, and their labor market integration could also be facilitated. And also, as far as what I know, I don't know too much about the Blue Card initiatives, but what I know about the plans, the changes, that it should be also applicable for refugees, is also kind of a development, which I personally, I mean, welcome,
Sure.
because that could help at least for the highly skilled refugees.
Richard, I don't know to what extent other parts of the world have blue card schemes or similar schemes, and whether there's anything we can learn from there in terms of making it work more effectively. You mentioned Canada as a model in many other ways. Do they have a similar system there, or can we learn anything from other parts of the world?
I was actually going to try and answer some of the earlier questions.
Please do
but
as well.
Just
Please
very
do.
quickly
Yeah.
on that. Yes, I mean, you know, in Canada and in other countries like Australia, point systems where preference is given to more highly skilled people in terms of, you know, in these cases, a permanent immigration, but also in terms of some temporary work as well. So it's not the same as a blue card scheme necessarily, but there are some elements
Sure.
which are similar.
Please do pick up on the other points. Yeah.
But you know, on this low skilled, high skilled divide, or you know, square in the circle, I think you know this really is quite a difficult issue, because whereas there doesn't appear to be a lot of political appetite for admitting more lower skilled migrant workers into the EU. And I think it's very important to say here at the outset that countries do need migration policies, and just because we've had in the last few years this refugee crisis, which has resulted in a large influx of refugees, doesn't mean that somehow this covers the migration policy and there's no need to admit non-refugees, so to speak, in terms of the labour market. But I understand, of course, the focus given the situation as it is at present. But, on this issue, this still doesn't resolve the problem that there are a lot of jobs, or increasingly a lot of industries that employ low-skilled workers where nationals no longer want to do those jobs. And so the arguments that we have a large unemployment or unemployment is growing, they still don't want to do those jobs. And of course, this goes to the issue of the quality of the job. It raises issues like, are we as part of the general population prepared to pay more for our services and food in order to ensure that these jobs become more quality jobs in terms of decent work for the people in them. These are questions which should all be part of a more sort of balanced and robust debate about the future of migration policy going beyond the sort of 4 or 5 year election cycles. And I just wanted to say one thing, because I know there was a question on the issue of how can we organize more solidarity. Yeah. And from an ILO perspective, and this is very much part of these guiding principles and access of refugees to the labour market, which I referred to earlier, social partners, employers and workers organisations have a very important role to play at the level of the workplace. They are on the ground. They can assist in with their constituents, and particularly not just a whole range of employers, but also workers in the workplace, but nationals and migrants, as well as refugees, to promote their inclusion both into work and into society, and also have a very important role to play in terms of determining or assessing the skills of refugees and others. So important groups that need to play a role. And that also at the broader policy level, there has been quite a lot of, I can say, solidarity between, for example, Business Europe and the ETUC, which issued a statement last year on essentially the refugee crisis in Europe and some of these issues which I'm referring to.
Thank you very much. I want to come back on this question of engagement in a moment, Abdul, but let me just first see any other questions, comments. Yes, please, at the back there. Please introduce yourself and please be brief. Thank you, sir.
Yes, I'm Crawford.
Can you press your little red button? That's it.
All right. I'm Crawford Austin. I'm Stephen Wolf's assistant within the non-ANSCRI. I would just like to recognise what the gentleman on the right there has said and agree with him completely. It is not the fault of refugees that they have arrived in Europe. It is not their fault as well too that they're there to find work. There's nothing wrong with that. And there is nothing wrong as well too with refugees requiring assistance because they've come to Europe. They've come to Europe because they have been bombed out of their houses and their homes, and they have been forced to come to Europe because the Americans have bombed them out of their homes. In Iraq, in Syria, in Libya, in Egypt, they tried to destabilize the government. They made Libya a basket case. Everybody has had to leave, and they've had to leave because of the Americans and the socialists, like Tony Blair, who have bombed these people out of their homes.
Let's not start.
Consequently, we owe the refugees a debt. We owe them a debt, and we must repay that debt to them. And I really hope that they make a success of their lives in Europe.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Let me come back before we try and do some conclusions. And Abdul, you talked right at the beginning about this importance of engagement, So don't make policy for people like you, but with people like you. What would your advice be to the policymakers in this room and to organizations like the ILO and Eurofund for really engaging with you in the most effective way? How do they do it, particularly when you're not yet already in the labor market? How can they reach people and how can they really engage with you? What should they do and what shouldn't they do?
The first thing, the centrums that we used to live, because there's in the whole Europe, there's a lot of centrums. The centrum that I used to live in it, we were 250 person. So those people, they are living in centrum, we should focus on them. We should communicate with them to ask them. In the centrum where I used to live, we start some kind of initiative to ask people what you used to work in your previous country. There were people, they were engineers, they were people, they were doctors, they were people, they know how to paint, they know people how to do normal jobs, and we make some kind of inside domestic initiative and we went to the city hall, and we told them we are a group of Syrian refugees we would like to involve in this society, because like that man said, we are in debt also for Europe. They accept us because everybody I think knows here in the room that nobody from Arabic countries, they accept us, and that's why we came here. I'm not saying this because I don't like to be here in Belgium or in Europe in general, but when you are in a very bad situation, first you seek help from the people that you understand them, the people that, let's say that first you go to your brother and then you go to your cousin, but for us, we had to escape, and everybody knows that there is no Arabic country they accept us to be in their countries. Sure. And I feel so ashamed sometimes to be Arabic and to be Muslim about this situation, because I had to leave. I had to lose everything during the way. I was with a family. They sank in the water, and it was a really awful trip. And now I'm here. I'm safe. So I'm doing this personally. That I'm doing something to pay back the debt that I have to Europe, that they accept me, they are give me a shelter, they give me a warm place. And that's why I'm trying to help as much as I can with anything I can. The communication, it has to be between the labor market if I was a policymaker, I would go to the people and to engage them, even if they don't speak any kind of language, because now I learn my language from movies and from songs. I've never went to school to learn English. I used always to put a movie and read the subtitle, and now I'm using the same way with Netherlands language, because I live in Flanders, and I finished now the 4th level out of 10. And I think for people, they said it's a very good thing that what you're doing because it's a really difficult language.
I can echo that.
and for people that if you go to those people in the Centrum and you communicate with them in any language, like I said, we can start with now if somebody offers me to work as a gardener, as a cleaner, as in anything, I would go, because I'm looking I'm not looking for money, I'm looking to integrate. And the thing that
job is the way to become part of the community.
Exactly, and the thing that you've learned from school, it's maybe 10% or 15% of the thing that you will learn it from the life school. So that's why I'm trying to, we have to engage those people, even if they are very educated men. Okay, finish your language, whatever language is, but first you have to be part of this society, to get to know the habits of the society, to get get some kind of a background.
And that key of why labour market integration is so central to overall integration into a community. You say it's not just about the money, it's about
it's
becoming
one of the most important environments.
Can I just ask all of you, in terms of engaging, not making policy for them, but making it with them, how effective is that now? I mean, you mentioned the social partners, but of course, trade unions generally representing people in work. So how do you reach the ones who are trying to access the labour market and also involve them and in your discussions? Richard, how in the ILO do you approach this issue, and do you think there is enough engagement with those you're trying to help at the moment?
Yes, I can just anecdotally just give you an anecdote of, because our Director General has in the last year or so visited a number of refugee camps in Jordan and Turkey, and when he asked them the question, what were the most important things for the refugees there, the first thing that they said was to find safety for themselves and their family, number one concern. And then secondly, they want to kickstart their lives, and that effectively, that essentially means finding work, regardless of whether they're in a refugee camp or based in the community. Now, of course, the point I was making earlier with regard to the role of labour market institutions, employment services, and assisting refugees in finding work, that's one form of engagement, and the need to ensure that their services are tailored to this population group, which is not always the case, because some countries have less experience of refugees than others, and how to assist them with finding work. And the second issue, obviously, and this relates to a point made earlier, is the whole issue of training. Not only language training, which of course is key, and I certainly would agree that this should not be something which is left before one begins to work. It's something that needs to continue during the employment experience as well. But also in terms of upgrading skills, and the ILO has programs, for example, in Turkey. So we also work in those countries which are hosting large populations of refugees with regard to access to the labour market there. And in Turkey, we have, particularly in the southern part of the country, where there's a large refugee population, vocational training programs to assist them with respect to access to the labour market.
Thank you very much. Clara, in terms of this engagement, how do you see the issue, and how effective are approaches now, do you think?
I really want to come back to the issue of the social partners' crucial role, and especially the trade unions' role, because of course it is their utmost interest, really, if they want to avoid social dumping, then of course they actually also, even if they represent the native workers or the workers who are there in their job, but I think that it is also their interest to try to upgrade or to match the skills the refugees have to the job itself, and accordingly to organize them training, and also to organize some kind of schemes within the workplace, which actually there are some good examples for that, the kind of mentoring programs, which are also in some cases led or initiated by the trade unions themselves. So I think that, the policies with them and engaging the migrants, I think this is something in which trade unions could also play a very important role in the workplace.
Thank you. And I think this topic we'll come back to in our next discussion when we look at how do we make sure we're now identifying those realities, we're identifying those challenges, and we're beginning to identify some of the areas of solution here while recognizing the deeply complex nature of the topic. But I want to be very unfair now, and I want to ask each of you, and I'll do this in reverse order to the way you spoke at the beginning. So Abdul, I'd like to start with you. If you had one plea, as a refugee, now settled here, one request, one thing you would like from European policymakers in particular, you've come here today, you're doing all that work with your voluntary organizations, one thing you would like them to do?
Finish the war in Syria.
That taken as
and
the
then
big.
We will go back and you will be so happy.
Okay, but assuming that for the time being at least you are with us, and it is great to have you with us both here today and in Belgium, but one thing you want them to do to ensure that people like you can get the best possible start when you get here, to make it easier for you to find that job that you're still looking for, and to really, as you said, give back, because you so much want to give back to the society that has taken you in. What would your priority, what's the thing you most want politicians like Brando to do?
For me as a refugee, the first and the most important thing is to find a solid ground to go from it. Because, like I said, I stayed in the Centrum for 9 months doing nothing, eating and sleeping, which in Syria I was 60 kilos and now 85. So it was, so we were doing absolutely nothing, only sitting and if we would like to do anything, you didn't get your papers yet. You didn't get your papers yet. So if I was a policymaker, okay, you come from Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, or whatever country you are, to make this moment, this period of 9 months, to make it 1 week or 2 weeks or something, then you decide, okay, I will be here in this country, I will get my papers in 1 week. Even if I get negative, okay, then I will go back and seek another thing. I don't want to lose, because I've lost 5 years of my life during the war, and I don't want to lose more time. And the second thing, if this period of time it's become shorter, then you can focus on how you want to start, because a lot of people, and I've met so many people in the Centrum where I used to live, and I'm going to so many Centrums here in Belgium. Because of this waiting, they have some kind of depression. And the thing that Clara said about the reunion also, for some people it will take 2 years, some people it will take 1 year and a half. And you don't know what happened in your country. For example, in Syria, my family in Aleppo or in Damascus, you don't know if they are still alive. So you keep thinking, you say, I don't want to learn, I don't want to learn, I'm thinking about my family. The most important thing in the life of a refugee, it's this 5, 3, 6, 8 months. Just waiting and doing absolutely nothing.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for being with us today. Clara, Brando said at the beginning, we need to be quick because people want answers from us. If people like him are to give one answer, one priority, one thing we need to do to address the issues we've been discussing and confront these new realities and challenges, what for you is the most important next step?
I think that the most important next step is that instead of cutting what I said, social allowances and services, they should be widened. They should be widened, and because this is the way how this is the ground labor market integration could be built on. And also, I think, as I said earlier, a long-term vision is needed, not just the short-sighted, as Brando said, kind of electoral cycle, 5 years or even less vision. And for that, that investment is needed with such policies which could help an effective and fast integration into the labor market.
Thank you very much. So reverse it. If we do not invest, we are investing in assets. We need to treat it like that, but we need to get on with it.
Yeah.
Richard, for you, the most important priority, if we are to give people the answers they are seeking, people like Abdul?
I think we've already touched upon it in the discussion, and that's, when we look at many refugees today, as well as migrants, they tend to be younger, they're enterprising, they have a lot to offer, both to the labor market and to societies. And we need to recognize this potential contribution. It is indeed recognized in some of the global discussions that have taken place around this issue. I mentioned the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda, also the New York Declaration for Refugees and Migrants, which was adopted by the General Assembly last year, also recognizes this contribution. But that is in this sort of rarefied fora. How do we translate what the international community already is agreeing to into the reality on the ground? And that's where there is this need for a balanced, robust, but also debate informed by facts and evidence. And it's a responsibility of all of us to generate that.
So those high-level goals are very important to put this issue on where it needs to be on the agenda, but it's that translation work that needs to involve all of you in the way you've outlined.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Brando, for you, and a priority for you as a politician, you've highlighted here some of the political dilemmas that this issue raises, and some of the things that you're having to confront when you deal with these legislative files. If you look ahead, and you've worked on a number of these areas, where do you see the key next step? What's the next thing we need to do to address those dilemmas and to really make sure that we take advantage of this enormous asset? We have an asset here wants to contribute to the community. The community needs it. We've talked about the low, the medium, the high skilled. What for you, of all the issues you've been working on, all the papers, reports you've done in this area, when you go to bed at night and think about this issue, what do you say? The one thing we've got to get done is, what is that thing?
Is to regain trust of citizens on how we deal with these issues. Because the problem is that there is a lot of mistrust towards the institutions in the way from both people that are here and that are staying for a long time idle, like the experience that was just told to us. The people that want to do things and cannot do, and at the same time, people that feel that we are not governing the phenomena. So it was said by Clara that there would be good to have politicians looking on the 5-year cycle, but I would be happy for having some national governments looking over 5 months ahead while they don't. So to be very frank, so I think this is the point. In my opinion, to regain trust, we need to show that a positive cycle on the mobility and integration can be created, like we already have in many places. And to do this, we need to invest. It was important to what you said. We need resources. We need for people that are able to do things to have opportunities, to be able to access the labor market as soon as possible, knowing that not all labor markets, not all places can absorb the same number of people. So we need also to go further in the issue of distribution of people inside the regions of the same country and among the European countries. Otherwise, we will not give them solid ground, as it was said, to go on. We will have a mistrustful environment of people that will feel that there are people that are not integrated, there will be this kind of growing of sentiments against people that are coming, as it was said, because they are escaping wars, destruction of their homes. And so we get back, and I conclude on the most contentious point that came out in this discussion, is the fact that there are different cases and different profiles. We cannot have, if we want to do a good job, we cannot have the same schemes. We have to have schemes and legal and channels and instruments for all, but we cannot have the same instruments for humanitarian migrants, for economic migrants, and for highly skilled, in this second case, highly skilled ones, like the blue card is taking care of, and medium or low skilled ones. We need to show that we govern this new challenge, because this is not an emergency. It's a structural issue that we have to tackle with structural policies that must be diversified for the profiles and for, as I said, the various different labor markets, regional situations that we have. To do this, we really need, as I said, political leadership and ability to look over the next elections. We need to do that, and we need a European Union with its institutions that incentivizes us, the politicians, to not look at the short term, but look for the longer term common good of the Europeans, that is, in my opinion, to be able to have a fair mobility for all, for people coming and for people inside the European Union. I think this must be a key priority and message from us.
Thank you very much. And that question of fair mobility, what does it look like for everyone? And how do we really achieve it? We will come back to in our second panel. But ladies and gentlemen, will you join me in thanking our panel very much? And I would like a particular round of applause for Abdul, who it is great that you came here to share your experience with us.
Thank you so much.
Wish you all the very best for the future. And please do keep come back and talking to us, because it's from hearing about very practical experiences, so eloquently put, that policymakers learn how to respond. So thank you to Abdul, and thank you to all of our panel. You may return to the comfy seats. So those are the new realities and the new challenges, and we've talked a lot about the importance of a coherent and longer-term response to this issue. As Brando said just then, it's a structural issue that needs to be tackled with structural policies. We want to focus now very much on that equal treatment question. We began to talk about social dumping in the last panel. What are the safeguards we need? We began to talk about the rights of workers. Let's delve into that. Think, how do we make fair mobility for all? And within that, what are the special needs of vulnerable groups like migrants, like people like Abdul? So let me bring up the panel as our nameplates appear. Javi López, MEP, who is a member of the European Parliament's Employment and Social Affairs Committee and works a great deal on these issues for the S&D Group. Marco Cilento, who is Mobility and Migration Advisor at the European Trade Union Confederation. Minos Mouzourakis, who is Asylum Information Database Coordinator at the European Council on Refugees and Exiles, known to many of you better as ECRE, and Laura Corrado, who is Head of Legal Migration and Integration Unit in DG Home in the European Commission. A very warm welcome to you all. And we will start, as we did last time. I'm going to ask Javi to just introduce the topic of this session, and then I will give a chance to our panelists to make short statements on how they see the challenge ahead, and then we'll open up the discussion, questions from me, and then all of you. But Javi, please do kick us off.
Okay, I will try to be fast. I will want to underline the last remarks of my colleague Brando. No? He was trying to explain, well, this is not an emergency. This is something structural, and probably the problems that we have behind this movement of people we will have more in the next years. And we need a logic scheme and a logic policy trying to be trying to have a diversification of this policy, underlining the different characteristics and the different reality that the different people who is arriving to Europe has, and especially trying to deal with a huge humanitarian crisis that we have in its borders, no? With an enormous increase in the number of people, refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants entering, I will say, irregular ways, because we don't have regular ways to arrive for most of them. And this is something that we should think about it. Member states, especially those countries more attractive for refugees and asylum seekers, are concerned on the cost and the consequence of the integration of this huge mass of people entering its borders. But we should think about the consequence of don't have investment and a real policy, because it will be a huge cost in the future. A huge problem for our society, but a huge problem for our economy, and it will have impact in our electoral process and in our institutions. Well, what does equal treatment and rights mean? It will be like the main topic of this discussion, no? Swift access of refugees and migrants to its rights and duties in the host national system, with special attention to reduce unnecessary bureaucratic burden. Secondly, quick access to education and training, as well as to labor market integration. We know that the language is the key point to enter in the labor market, and we should have a real dimension of training in this issue. Early assessment of tailored necessities to be integrated in an effective and comprehensive social system of integration. Cultural courses, housing, social benefits, we talked about the language. Protect them against its special vulnerability to be abused and exploited. We know that we are talking about a real vulnerable group, and then we should fight against this kind of abuse that we see in the labor market. Validation and recognition of its formal and informal skills. This is something, because we were talking before. We have people that they are arriving to Europe with skills, with high skills or medium skills, and they need a validation, and special attention for children, specifically unaccompanied ones, women and elder migrants and refugees. No? To conclude, I will say three things. In the short term, obviously, the cost to facilitate access and dignity of refugees and migrants could be bigger than the benefits. Obviously, this is the dignity discussion. It is a moral obligation and a legal one. But this must not be a matter of cost and benefits, no? But a matter of human dignity. In the middle term, the social and labor market integration of refugees and migrants could be a burden for our social security, at least. No? We cannot lie ourselves, but we cannot afford to build a dual society within our borders. And this is the risk with this structural challenge that we have. And in the long term, it seems that this initially costly integration not only will be a matter of justice and human rights, but a benefit for our societies, a benefit for our economies, making more innovative and dynamics our economies, and making more sustainable our societies. And I think this is the key point in this discussion. We are talking about a cost, an obligation, a legal, a moral one. It is a huge challenge for our societies and for our member states, for our institution, the EU, but at the same time could be opportunity. Could be an opportunity to try to show to the rest of the world how we deal with this huge challenge, not like the last years, and how we use this innovative part of the economy that we could have in our labor market to have a better future and better societies.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed. And that very much echoes in terms of we talked quite a lot about public opinion in the last session, and how do you frame that debate in a way that will enable us to deliver these sorts of responses and that balance of cost, which, as you say, it's not cost-benefit, it's human dignity, but there's also an immense opportunity. Come back on that, I hope, as we talk about what we mean by fair mobility and how we translate that into practice. But let's get a broad perspective on this from our other panelists as well. Marco, from your perspective, from the European Trade Union Confederation perspective, how do you see the key challenges to ensure equal treatment and rights for all workers?
It means that for a moment we keep the refugees aside, in the sense that from your title and the contents we are trying to address, we are talking about all workers.
All workers, and
all
then within
workers.
that, I'd
and
like to focus on what that means for the refugees.
Being aware that we have millions and millions of third-country nationals that are trying to find a good employment in Europe, and 35 migrants in general, EU and non-EU. But as Europeans, we have lessons to keep in mind that we have learned in the past, and for us, it's as unions and our North Star. That's migration can be an issue of freedom. So, for the Europeans, labor mobility is a freedom, and thanks to create this freedom, we have created a box that we have filled in with rights. So in the EU legislation, the labor legislation was very linked and stemming from this freedom in order to make it concrete. For certain aspects, this lesson can also be brought into the box of rights of third-country nationals. And then we have two things to do, is to create minimum standards that cannot be derogated for economic reasons, as we did in Europe, creating minimum standards, harmonizing the national legislation. This is one of the things we have already done in Europe when Europe was a social Europe. Maybe we have to be back on this. The second thing is equal treatment. Equal treatment is a very simple principle to be brought into the legislation. You don't need very complicated articles. You just have to declare equal treatment according to law, collective bargaining practices. And equal treatment applies to all. Women, men, migrants, non-migrants, also to stupid people like Corwin Mikke, with his little brain, is less productive, is less intelligent than others, but always also Corwin Mikke deserve equal treatment. So, and this should be explained. The problem is to produce the legislation. So if you have one person which is make his daily exercise of stupidity, for instance, trying to explain to Laura Corrado, she's a woman, she cannot earn as much as a man, or he's maybe has Greek origin, I don't know, and that is why you have to earn less. If it's one, okay, we are tolerant, we make exercise of tolerance, and we just disregard the problem. But if we have a number of people that take these concepts and make it widely used in our society, we have a huge problem in creating the rules of the game or to adjust. And I think that the Commission that is goes through the fitness check of the EU legislation will have big issues because of dominance of stupidity. Just another example, the main Italian newspaper, Corriere della Sera, which is equivalent to the Times or Le Monde in France. One journalist, whose name for the Italians just give you the idea that it cannot be very clever, Cazzullo, so you know, was trying to explain that the Italian coffee is not good because the taste is nicer than in other countries, but because it was made by Italians. If it's made by migrants, it's not good. It's not the taste which is good, but who is going to do it? And we are talking about the main Italian newspapers, read by millions of people. If this is the attitude, it becomes very difficult to create the conditions to have a good legislation. As unions, we always say, why you are not defending your labor market and you are so open with migration? Just give you, because we try to stick with the reality. I'm going to close very fast. One example, because many have said that's the economic arguments, that migrants steal the jobs, etc. But who are the countries where more problems with migration today? UK, with Brexit. UK is growing, has been part of the European Union, by 3-4% per year. Full employment and raising wages, increasing wages. So there are no economic justification to be scared by the attraction of migrants. And I can continue. Netherlands, Eastern countries, and the Commission made a very good work in the national reports in the economic governance explaining how, emerging these contradictions, and
Okay.
I will invite you to read it.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. You talked there about it's a simple principle to put into the law. But if it's a simple principle to put in the law, what are the barriers? What are the challenges that particularly vulnerable groups like refugees, migrants face? Because a lot of it is in law. We have anti-discrimination legislation, etc. What are the barriers that prevent that equal treatment is one of the questions I really would like to touch on. Minos, from your point of view, the European Council for Refugees, can you just tell me how you see the challenge now and where we need to put our focus if we're going to get this right?
Absolutely, thanks very much, and thanks for the opportunity to be here today. I could have hoped for a better introduction to the topic, coming in from more of an asylum lens and perspective, and I have to be completely frank, I'm no expert on labor rights, but I do agree that equal treatment as a principle and as a legal notion is something that sounds very simple and very easy to implement, and it's, let's say, the baseline that every migration policy should be able to respect. But in very practical terms, when we have different categories of people, some of whom face very specific challenges and barriers, equal treatment is something that is very difficult to put into practice and may actually result in disadvantaging those that are more vulnerable or need a bit of a head start to make sure they can integrate into the labor market. Now, when we talk about refugees and asylum seekers, we've already discussed quite a bit the issues of accessing the labor market even in formal terms. We mentioned the 9-month time limit, the possible reduction to 6 months. That's all very nice. It's a very tangible and a very, let's say, easy to pinpoint change in the EU legal framework that I think has gotten most of the political attention from co-legislators. But in very practical terms, it might even be the least of the concerns for asylum seekers. I wanted to give an example that I came across recently of one of the countries that has, in my opinion, one of the best and most easily accessible labor market schemes for asylum seekers, Sweden, where the waiting period for an applicant to access the labor market is 1 day. After 1 day, you're actually able to obtain the right to work and then seek employment. Even in terms of administrative formalities, things are much easier in Sweden than in other countries. And last year, out of 28,000 people who got the right to work, less than 5% found employment. Now, this is particularly telling because if things are that difficult in Sweden, we can only imagine what happens to countries that have sector restrictions. Again, as we discussed, allow asylum seekers to work only in specific areas, that have maximum working time limits. This is also something that happens in many member states. Or apply labor market tests, undue formalities for people to get work permits, and the list goes on. So even if we have 6 months instead of 9 for a person to be, let's say, lawfully entitled to labor market access under the EU directive, that doesn't mean that automatically they're going to get employment. There's a whole lot of hurdles that need to be overcome. And beyond all those, I do subscribe to the observation that material and practical concerns are of the utmost importance. Language is something that is obvious to everybody. Nobody can have any hopes of accessing employment without learning the language. But it's not guaranteed in national legislation or EU legislation. Neither the Reception Conditions Directive nor the Qualifications Regulation that deals with people who have gotten status, who have been deemed to be in need of international protection, actually mandate states clearly to provide them with free language courses. And in many countries, I could name Greece, I could name Croatia, I could name Bulgaria, actually do not offer these language courses, which means that we expect people to integrate in our host societies and be active members and find employment, but we don't help them actually learn the language. How can this actually work in very practical terms? So there we see that equal treatment sounds very good in law, but if we don't have the means to ensure that refugees, asylum seekers, but any other category, I would say, of migrant who does not have those necessary basic skills and is not accustomed to the host country, it cannot work in practice. Just a final word, because I also think this is very important when we discuss equal treatment and the link between labor rights and the common European asylum system, is fragmentation. And there I think there's a lot of discord and often paradoxical discussions taking place on one hand by, let's say, the employment people. The European semester reports of the Commission are a very good example, highlighting how integration works with sustainable systems, with security of residence, with proactive approaches by member states. On the other hand, the asylum package proposed by another set, let's say, of policymakers and debated by other policymakers, even within this House, mainly by the Libe Committee, for instance, where we see distinctions not only between specific categories of asylum seekers. The proposals say that asylum seekers would get a right to work after 6 months, but if their claim is accelerated on the basis of 5-6 grounds, they won't get any labor market access at all. Member states actually want to extend that exclusion to inadmissibility cases, for instance. When we talk about people with status, refugees, so convention refugees, stricto sensu, would have equal treatment on more areas than people with so-called subsidiary protection status, for whom member states will still be allowed to apply derogations, for instance, on social assistance provisions. Now, if you try to explain this to a Ministry of Labor or to an employment office, it sounds very complicated. To me, it already sounds like something that is very, very difficult to implement. So I think the different silos need to be broken to some extent and make sure that we're coherent when discussing how best to integrate such a population. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So a real dilemma there, your Swedish case. You can do it in one day, and yet less than 5% may come back to one thing Abdul pointed to, which is if you don't have your papers yet, that unwillingness to invest in you, employ you. But it'd be interesting to come back on what those real obstacles are, which make whatever may sound good in legislation not work, and how maybe we can begin to tackle them. Because I think often at a politician level, you say, oh, fix the law, and then we're there. But it's obviously about much more than that. So thank you very much, Minister. Lara, from your perspective, how do you see the challenge in terms of equal treatment and rights broadly and specifically for these sectors of very vulnerable workers? Are we doing enough? Do we need? And this sort of contradiction between, or not contradiction, but just passing new laws doesn't necessarily do it.
Yes, thanks very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Well, I think I'll pick up from what has been said and a bit expand. Certainly, I mean, we in legal migration legislation for workers, we do have as a general principle, with one exception, equal treatment for working conditions and a number of other areas. So that's certainly the principle is applied, broadly speaking, in legal migration and also as regards refugees in the asylum law. There is fragmentation across the categories, I will not deny that, also across the different categories of workers and also across different statuses of people in need of protection. Some might have a justification in terms of duration of stay in the EU. Seasonal workers stay not as long as long-term residents, so it's a certain differentiation of, let's say, the level of rights, especially in terms of access to social security, is justified in my view, and it is quite normal across member states. But of course, it does not have to be discriminatory, and it has to make sense. So there is a certain fragmentation in European law, but also in national law. But as a principle, equal treatment is a principle that is recognized in the legislation. But as you said, and as also other speakers said, this is not enough. There are a lot of practical obstacles. I think I haven't followed entirely the previous sessions, but this is, of course, linked to the discussion on integration and how much we invest, the member states, invest into integration policies for refugees, but also for other migrants, in terms of providing, well, training, language training first, and all other types of support that has been mentioned. Of course, when it comes to refugees, we have to bear in mind that they are a particularly vulnerable category of persons, so the access to labor market might not be the first priority. We need to address their trauma, we have to support them. I mean, that's obvious, I think. But once, and as it was also mentioned, once, let's say, this is addressed, then, of course, there is certainly also from their side a willingness to contribute to the society they are living in. But we need to invest, and I think, I mean, I would agree with those that have said that it requires an important investment at the beginning. And it is true that the integration of refugees, there are studies, it takes more time than for labor migrants. This is obvious because labor migrants, they choose to come to a place. In principle, they speak the language, they work. It's obviously easier for them to integrate than for somebody who has been forced to move and to go to a country of which he or she doesn't speak the language. So it requires more investment, more support, but the same studies also show that in the medium long term, integration is possible, is successful. And so I would say the investment now must be important, but it will pay off later, not only from an economic viewpoint, because if there is an integration into labor market people, but also in terms of cohesion of our societies. Of course, we are talking about our societies after all. I mean, migrants, refugees are people that live with us. I mean, so the fact that they are integrated, that they share our values, that they share, it's an interest of all of us. And this leads me also to the other challenge that has also been raised and on which there is no easy solution, which is how do we change the narrative? We discussed at the Migration Forum last week, and you were there as well, within our societies about migration, about refugees. What do we do? I mean, and I think what I have retained from there and from other experiences that there are actually successful experiences in some local situations of people, cities, mayors, regions that have managed, in fact, to change the narrative, and not only the narrative, but to make integration work. It is difficult. They have all had changes, but they have invested in all sorts of policies, which can go to security policies, to education, to social policies, labor market policies, and they have done all of this at the same time in a number of years. Of course, now when politicians, the long term is 5 months, it's difficult to do that. But I mean, still, I think we should try all to think in the medium long term, not only the politicians, and I think this is what we are also trying to do with integration policy on Commission side. And I have to say that I will not deny that there is total coherence on the Commission side on all, but I can tell you that on integration we are working very well and very closely with DG Employment, with DG Education and Culture. Since we adopted the action plan last year, we really managed to mainstream integration at European level. I'm really very proud of this, very happy that we managed to do that, and we will continue to do that. Of course, there are other issues, broader issues about coherence of European Union policy on asylum and migration, which, I mean, it's maybe another hearing, another conference. But
I think it would be.
But I mean, I can tell you that integration is really, and I mean, we are working also, as Marco knows, engaging very much with the social partners now, with the economic stakeholders, to work with all stakeholders on integration, particularly labor market integration. Well, I'll stop now, but of course.
Thank you very much indeed. Javi, can I just ask you to put this in the context? You have two things running at them. You have a broad campaign, a Social Europe campaign, social rights, which you launched last week. And you are also calling very strongly for this, what you call a European pillar of social rights. How do you see this issue and ensuring that we translate a principle into reality, because we're hearing so much about how it isn't. How do you see that as a central part? How do we make sure that if we have such a pillar, it is solid, meaningful and enforceable for migrant workers as well as for indigenous EU citizens? How do we get this issue where it needs to be within that pillar?
Well, the point is we agree with the principle, no? Equal treatment, opportunities, and so on. The point is how to do it. And then I think we need four things, no? First of all, legislation, rules, obviously, no? Rights. But it's not enough. It's obvious that it's not enough, no? We see with the gender gap, for example. It's not enough, the legislation. Secondly, we need policies. It's something different, policies with mechanism, instruments. Third, we need institutions for develop our policies. And fourth, we need funding. And this is something different, and we need especially extra funding. Because one of the main problems that we had the last 2 years when we were discussing about like refugees, migrants, and so on. Well, if we put the resources that we have now in vulnerable groups directly to these new vulnerable groups that we have now, it will be extra vote for the extreme right. It's very obvious. And this is something that is happening. We need extra funding for these new vulnerable groups that we have. And how put everything together? Well, we have a nice opportunity with the social pillar. Theoretically, it is one of the programs, the ideas of the Commission. We were working in the Parliament. We know that the social partners, they are thinking a lot. They were thinking about the last months. We don't know exactly what will be the social pillar. It's more it's more like an idea, an umbrella, and so on. But if we try to think about our vulnerable groups, and it's obvious that the migrants, the asylum seekers, they are a vulnerable group. And if we put all of this under the umbrella, the legislation, policies, institutions, rules, and funding, extra funding, I think it will be a good opportunity to have elements in the umbrella.
Thank you. I don't know how others see this pillar and whether they think it is a useful way forward. You have that umbrella on which you can hang this. But specifically also, the S&D Group has called, given what you've all said about legislation and it doesn't deliver, I still wanted to ask, taking Javi's first of his 4 points, we need more legislation. You have called for a framework directive on decent working conditions, etc. How important do you think that would be? Could it make a difference? Or would you focus on his other pillars, his policies, institutions and funding, because the legislation, just putting something into the law, as we've heard from all of you, doesn't necessarily deliver? How do we need some legislation that covers broadly all workers with specific reference to migrants? Or Minos, how would you tackle this?
This is one of the very tricky questions to ask to a lawyer, because we always love when we see legislation. But I would say I would agree that legislative standards are one of those things that are definitely necessary, although they're not sufficient. So the law already needs to be an enabler of better integration and equal treatment rather than setting barriers. That means beyond getting into a discussion on new legislation, making sure that our existing instruments, the ones that are now being reformed, are sufficiently protective, do not pose undue obstacles on people accessing the labor market and those within it. In terms of working conditions, again, beyond EU law, we can also look at international instruments that take a broader reading of migrant workers' rights, the extent to which these are subscribed to by member states, whether there are political difficulties in getting more traction and getting more engagement with those. What I wanted to get to on the point that you raised based on the Swedish example and what goes beyond the law and what the law cannot actually achieve relates to the other points that you raised in terms of policies and funding for those. And there I have to absolutely acknowledge the Commission's effort in mainstreaming integration, especially from the funding perspective. We not only have an asylum migration integration fund that has specifically earmarked funding for integration-related measures, but also support available from other sources of funding, the European Social Fund and others. And there, the challenge is to make member states not buy into that as, let's say, an act of goodwill, but to actually utilize funding that is already there to implement priorities that they have committed to. So in terms of monitoring that implementation and being able to properly evaluate and control how these funds are spent, including through the eyes of the European Parliament, to me that is key. Because this is one very tangible way in which we can make sure that the legal standards and the funding available for those actually translate into reality.
Thank you very much. Marco, for you, this broader question of the European Pillar of Social Rights, how important is it? Could it be? And would you see the need for more legislation, maybe this framework directive that is being called for? Or would you put the focus on some of the other tools that Javi was talking about?
I mean, we have always asked for a framework directive. There were no conditions, and I don't think that we have today still interested for us. I think that we have a couple of problems that's also with the Commission should be further discussed. One is the better regulation framework. Now I'm more technical than political, let's say, but it's also very political, the better regulation framework, because we know that in principle it was born with the idea to make better legislation, yes, which is fine, okay? But now the criteria to establish when the rules are more effective or less effective had 9 criteria, but in the past we have exercised only one criteria, which is the benefit-cost relationship or ratio, maximizing the impact with a very utilitarian approach. If we don't abandon, and this is also creating a very top-down approach to legislation, which doesn't give space to legislative from the bottom. That could be the parliament also. Sometimes it's very difficult to make something emerging from, but also from social partners. So, or civil society, etc. I think that also in the view of the refit of the migration legislation on the economic migration, etc., this will be a huge argument, maybe a bit technical, but very substantial, because I think that's the risk that we don't touch the real concrete problems that people find, and we cannot put the person at the center of the legislation, but we also have other interests, right? But for us, it's very important to put the person. The blue card applicant that takes 2 years to receive an answer from the, so this is one of the problems, for instance, that we want to address. European Pillar of Social Rights. Once again, if we start again to harmonizing, searching for upward convergence of rights, fine. The problem is that if we exclude the undocumented migrants from fundamental rights, is a countersense that we cannot really afford at European level. For that reason, we have, maybe you have in the folder the brochure we have created, I mean, trade unions defend.
I think they're probably on the table by the door. Yes, you can pick them up
on your way out.
Trade unions
defend undocumented migrants with proposals that we have elaborated also thanks to the support of PICUM. PICUM is an umbrella organization very specialized.
We've already heard from them from the floor
today.
We
have represented, I know that she helped me a lot on this regard, so we know. But for us, it's been very important to make this, and we will continue to propose the Commission, even if with not a big success until now, but I'm confident that in the future this topic will be taken in more serious consideration, because we are talking about 3 million people, and with the refugee crisis and the fact that most of the permits released to the asylum seekers are temporary, we have a huge amount of people that will be forced to stay irregularly. So in general, framework directive, yes, if it's possible. Today we have maybe urgent challenges, bringing the refugees at work, opening legal channels for, and the blue card that should be finalized as soon as possible, possibly with the amendments we have proposed as unions, but this is not up to us only to decide. But these are real priorities, and European Social Pillar, let's see what will happen, but please don't exclude the people who are suffering more from exploitation, from the rights. I mean, this is really something that as a European we cannot really conceive either.
Thank you very much. Lara, from your perspective, a word, if you would, on the pillar of social rights and how you might see this developing. But in terms of legislation, and do we need more, or is it about these other tools, the policies, the institutions, the funding? And if you wanted to react to that comment on undocumented workers as well, I don't know whether you want to pick up on that or not.
If I have to.
I feel that I'm feeling their pain. There's obviously...
I will not refrain. No, well, social pillar, I am in a bit of a difficult situation in the sense that it has been moved to April. There are still discussions on what exactly it should be, including with social partners. So it's difficult to preempt that discussion. But certainly, I mean, as far as we have been involved in the discussion with our colleagues in DG Employment, it has always been intended that as for labor law legislation, this covers everyone, so also migrants that are working in the EU, so they would not be excluded, as far as at least the legal migrants. The undocumented migrants, well, there are several issues there. Well, first of all, I don't want to be legalistic, but it's also true that our legal basis, at least on migration, talks about rights, legiferating on rights of third country nationals residing legally in a member state. So it's already, I mean, I think disputable if we are really competent to regulate that, although there are certainly, well, first of all, there is the Charter of Fundamental Rights, which applies to all EU legislation, so that's clearly all fundamental rights have to be respected. There are some provisions providing for rights of irregular migrants waiting for return in the Return Directive, so it's not that there is nothing at all, but a specific instruments covering undocumented migrants is different, well, legally, but also politically, as you can understand. Today, it's perceived by all member states, and not only as something being potentially a pull factor, the fact of regularizing somebody whose, for example, application for asylum has been rejected, or who has entered irregularly and not even having applied for asylum. So it is problematic from the European Union perspective, and it is also the reason why I don't know if it has been mentioned this morning, the UN Convention on Migrants' Rights has not been ratified by any member state, EU member states, nor by the EU, because it covers both, also undocumented migrants, which is a difficulty for member states from this perspective. So I know we have to talk about this, and I'm certainly happy to have a discussion with civil society, with the trade unions, further, but it is a difficult topic to discuss and certainly to legislate about. But we are aware that there is an issue. I also want to mention something important, an instrument that exists, which is the Employer Sanction Directive, which in fact it's a directive that sanctions employers that are employing and exploiting irregular migrants. So that's something that exists to protect also irregular migrants from labor exploitation, and it is an important instrument which needs to be enforced more. I agree, there will be an implementation report this year. We will try to push member states to carry out more inspections, and this is a general point about the enforcement of the legislation that exists. We can have the best legislation in the world. If it's not enforced from the Commission in the sense of ensuring that member states transpose the law, yes, but also by the member states, labor inspectorate, and so on, to be sure that it is really enforced, that people are not exploited on the grounds. And this is now the weak point. I think that Marco knows it better than me, what happens in many member states.
Do you see a role for the Commission in that? Because there have been suggestions that you should have some inspection rights of your own.
Well, I think it's, first of all, I think it's always difficult for the Commission to go in all member states and ensure that, I mean, we have it for the Schengen evaluations, you know, at the borders, which is quite a specific system of evaluating border controls and so on. I mean, it's a question also of resources and of competencies for the moment, but I think, I mean, we are certainly will be pushing member states to ensure better enforcement at national level of the legislation. We have, I mentioned employer sanctions, but also we have the Seasonal Workers Directive, which has just has to be transposed since last September. We have launched infringement proceedings against those member states not having transposed it. So it takes time. I mean, even when we have good legislation, and we do have some good pieces of legislation, I'm not sure the problem is to have more rules. We are carrying out the fitness check exercise, which is an evaluation of the legal framework on legal migration to see what are the problems, gaps, inconsistencies, and this will be very important. But I'm not sure that the problem is only or primarily the law at European level. We saw that even at national level, when it's the best legislation, for example, in Italy, they have strengthened recently the legislation against labor exploitation, but the problem is not the law. The problem is to check that it is implemented.
Indeed. So quick thought on that enforcement question. And as you say, it's also a resource question, because you can't enforce without the resource to do it. How important is that? And then I'll come out to the room. Javi, I mean, we really do we know enough? We had this point earlier. Brando was talking about a crisis of policy. And then Richard from the ILO was saying we also have a crisis of diagnosis, in the sense we don't necessarily know enough. Do we have the resource being put into making sure laws on equal treatment and anti-discrimination are properly being enforced? Or is that an area where you would like to see more attention?
Well, I think we have a problem of enforcement. This is like the main point. Because we don't have enough funding. The EU has not, this is one of the problems. The EU, the Commission, like the European institutions, we are not having enough strength in front of the member states. This is really clear. We are not talking about this, but we can talk about refugees and the problem of the movement of refugees. But this is also a symptom of our problems. And then, well, we should try to, with more extra funding, with better and new institutions, policies. But, well, I will say three things, no? We should be strong with the principles, but at the same time, we have to be flexible with the policies, thinking in the diversity of the people that we are talking about. And third, we must be really demanding with the funding. And this is one of the main discussions that we will have in the Parliament.
Yeah. We'll come back to that money issue if we have time a little bit later. But Minas, just in terms of this enforcement question, and I'm wondering the degree to which, do we know your staggering Swedish statistics, you can get work after 1 day, but less than 5% do. Do we know, have they done work on why the numbers are so low, and if they are, how much of this is in terms of enforcing legislation that employers can't discriminate, etc. Do we know what is behind it? And Marco, to your question about really the role of the social partners in terms of highlighting the problems and the lack of enforcement, and whether there's more that you could do. But Minos first, please, and then I'm coming out to all of you.
So on the Swedish example, I wouldn't have much more information on the deeper reasons behind that. But I would stress again that on a comparative scale, we're talking about one of the best examples compared to other member states, where you have much more sizable and easily identifiable problems in not only the transposition of EU law, but also its implementation. And there, I would see a role for the European Commission, not only in making sure that the relevant instruments are properly transposed, which is actually what has been taking place as a process since last summer when it comes to the reception directive, but also making sure that law is translated into practice. Of course, we're at a bit of a crossroads with the asylum package because we're talking about a new reform before having monitored and properly evaluated the impact of the current one. But what would be interesting as an example when it comes to the access of asylum seekers to the labor market, for instance, is that the recast version of the directive that was recently transposed in national laws of the member states did not just alter the time limit and reduced it to 9 months, it also referred to effectiveness of access to the labor market, right? And when it comes to this component of the improved, let's say, legislative standard, very little, if anything, has changed in the laws and the practice of most member states. And this is a very important observation when it comes to monitoring and enforcing those requirements. We would have to make sure that even though we're discussing potential reforms and different visions for the common European asylum system, that the existing standards are properly monitored. And there the mechanisms are clear, I would say.
Thank you very much. Marco, comment to this enforcement issue broadly and whether you think you see more of a role for the social partners in addressing this in the future.
Yes, of course, there are a couple of things. Mr. Lopez was correctly saying that we need a mix of rights, policies, institutions, fundings. I see, for the enforcement, for me, the policies are very important and also the institutional fundings. We already talked about the legal framework, but somehow there is the issue of the stupidity we are talking for of the people that's come back on the impediment to create the real policies.
Unfortunately, you can't legislate against stupidity.
What's the?
Unfortunately, you can't legislate against stupidity.
No, but this is something that we have to address because you should. Then it's also, then in practice, what can be done. What I've been surprised recently discussing on the blue card and collecting the opinion of my members on the blue card, I was extremely surprised to see in the Netherlands, civilized Netherlands, how many violations there was in the legislation of employment of qualified people. They call it knowledge workers or special legislation for employment of recently graduated people. And in some years, based on the inspectorates, so maybe it's true that inspectors go where they suspect there are troubles, so it's true that the rates of violation could be high. But I was frankly struck by that they found in some years also that 70% of the employment contracts of graduated people were in violation of the law, and in average 20% of the people qualifying for high-skilled employment, so receiving permits for high-skill, and the greatest majority of these violations were concerning the salary actually paid. Difference gap between the wage declared and the wage actually paid. And I think this is something we have to reflect upon because we are also talking about, of course, the fact that because of the austerity measure, the public services have been reduced and the support to the migrants have been reduced. So, but also the inspectors that have less resources. And this is a huge issue for enforcement. As trade unions and social partners, I can say what the trade unions are doing. The trade unions, the brochure I was mentioning is based on the facts and evidences collected by our contact points providing assistance to migrants. We already had the possibility to talk about this in other hearings. Here is called Migrant Net because we create this European network in order to give more visibility to the work that these contact points do. There are hundreds and hundreds all over Europe. and for us is a huge instrument because outside the workplace, we still have a place where we can help people to renew the permits, register in municipalities, solve problems at work, implement the legislation, in fact, often in partnership with local authorities. So for us, this is. For the employers, now we are trying to, thanks also to the support of DG Home Affairs, we are trying to create a more stable platform on which trade unions and employers can work together, in this case, more focused and targeted on the integration of refugees and asylum seekers that in this moment requires maybe a bigger attention, just also to create a different narrative for the one that the students are trying to spread.
Thank you very much. Questions or comments to our panel? Yes, please. And don't forget to introduce yourself.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Frank Thune from the European Network on Independent Living. And it's been a fascinating debate, so I will try to be brief and summarize all the thoughts that have been going around in my head. So the European Network on Independent Living is a network for the promotion of the right of disabled people to live independently and in the community. And I would like to pick up on the things that have been said here about the need for investment and also the fragmentation of actually rights to make the freedom of movement and labor mobility a reality. Because if we would focus on asylum seekers or migrants with a disability, for instance, then they would come probably to Europe and they would have the right maybe to enter the labor market, but their disability would not be recognized. They would not have any right to basic assistance like physiotherapy or any other technical equipment that they need to really be able to enter the labor market. So the obstacles posed will be very much higher and will make it impossible for them to enter the labor market, while many of the social benefits that are guaranteed by European and national law are related to being active in the labor market. So it's like this vicious circle that they can't escape because they don't have the first rights and assistance and services that they need to enter the labor market, they can never enter the labor market. So even for disabled people already living in Europe, like myself, for instance, it is difficult to move from one European country to another European country and go there to work because you would lose your recognition of disability and also your right to support services like physiotherapy or personal assistance. So I think the social pillar, and let's hope indeed that it applies to migrants as well, is a good solution for this because the social pillar cannot add legislation but just interpret the current legislation as being if you move from one European country to another, you will not necessarily lose your recognition as a disabled person, and with that, all the rights of assistance and services.
So a crucial element to ensure real fair mobility. And I want to come back to this question of access to services and that being very much part of the rights issue we're discussing in a moment. But let's thank you so much for that, sir. Any other questions or comments? I'll come here and then, Lilana, I'll come back to you. But please, here first. Thank you.
Okay, I come from Italy, Italian trade unions. I want to make a comment because we have seen in the discussions different levels, a shift in the language and therefore a different approach to certain problems. We talk about equal treatment, but now we are talking about, in certain circumstances, about fair treatment. We have to be very careful because when we discuss about new legislation or new policies, there is a big difference between equal treatment and fair treatment. And we have seen when we discuss about Brexit that, many politicians, many members of the parliament even, or colleagues say, well, we have to guarantee fair treatment. And we enter in a very shadow context that nobody knows what fair treatment is. And even in some European legislation, we talk about fair treatment. So this is
is it a word you would prefer to avoid?
Yes, of course, because if we are talking about principles, we have principles equal treatment. It's something much more better defined than fair treatment, because fair It might be, well, for migrants, we can guarantee less social protection. If it is equal, it should be equal, not fair. Fair might be.
Thank you.
Many
I'll ask
other
the panel
things.
to define what they mean when they talk about fair mobility in a moment, and whether they would agree that it's a difficult term or not. Lilana, I promised you the floor. Yes.
Thanks. Lilana from PECOM again. There's obviously a lot that I could pick up from the discussion on undocumented, but I won't take much time for that. Just to say a couple of, that we don't have any evidence still on regularization being a pull factor, so we do need to discuss this. Undocumented migrants have human rights from a lot of international legislation aside the Migrant Workers Convention, and as Laura very rightly listed, some of the ones in EU legislation. So as always, we remain open to discuss how to also implement those and advance their rights in EU legislation. So speaking of which, what is my recommendation? We have launched this week a brochure, and it's talking about an effective complaints mechanism. There's also copies there. This is an effective complaints mechanism for all workers we see as really an implementation issue in terms of equal treatment. How can equal treatment be assured for all workers regardless of status? In the title it says undocumented, but that's because we're emphasizing that point. But this is a tool that we see as a part of managing the labour market and labour standards, not connected only to migrant workers.
So for you, it's very important to address this whole issue in the context of equal treatment for everyone. That's
exactly.
Key.
It's very much within that, and it's about avoiding competition. When we're talking about social dumping, we're talking about huge exploitation of migrant workers. We're talking about wage theft. We're talking about people not at all the statistics that you were just listing, Marco, around the systematic discrimination that even regular migrant workers are facing. We can only imagine what this is for the undocumented workers. So I won't go into the detail, but essential is the implementation of the labour standards that apply to all workers, whether they're regular or irregular, by having access to the labour courts, to the labour inspectors, to complaints mechanisms, without there being any repercussions for their migration status. We call it a firewall, and it needs to be through from the labour inspection all the way to the courts and access to remedies and compensation.
Okay.
Details in here, and
lots of paperwork to pick up as you lead, lots of homework from this event. Could I first, we'll come back to that in a moment in terms of whether we need specific and targeted actions for the particularly vulnerable groups like migrants and refugees, or whether this point that Lilana's making, it is better to address everybody, and that will ensure that you address the most vulnerable. But before we do that, Javi, this point about equal and fair, because we're talking a lot about fair mobility. It is a central plank of the S&D Group's campaign. Do you understand the concern? Do you share it at all?
Because, especially in Brussels, we have a lot of words that, it's a balanced proposal. What's the meaning of this? It's balanced, yeah. And we have this kind of Euro, bubble words and concepts that we use a lot, and it's, entering in a shadow, in a room of a shadow. And I understand this. We defend equal treatment. We have to stand with equal treatment, obviously. But at the same time, we have to be aware that the labor market, the migrants, the refugees, even the refugees, it's a huge group, and we have to be smart, targeting and focusing in different groups, and trying to have legislation, or especially policies, instruments, flexible to everybody. This is my point in the discussions. Not about different treatment. No, this is the point. And I know that these concepts could use to have another kind of ideas, and I have also this fear when I discuss here. But I will want to underline something. The point about this, and this was one of the parts of the discussion in all the panels, what should be the EU? And for us, and I think we share this opinion, is the Europe is a community of rights. Should be a community of rights. This is one of the, it's based should be based on this. And when we are talking about community of rights, it's to everybody, and it's equal rights. Obviously, in the labor market, for the migrants, gender, everything. But also between countries. And this is like the point, the key point. This was the key point in the discussion with Brexit, for example, if we stand with our community of rights or not.
Thank you. Laura, you want to come in?
Yes, thanks. So I react immediately. I think that the word fair indeed has been abused, particularly in the discussions about free movement of EU citizens leading up to the Brexit referendum. Because there behind that there was indeed the idea of limiting the existing rights of EU citizens to the mobility, the free movement within the EU. So yeah, I understand the concerns. But as regards the migrants in the sense of third country nationals under, I would say, EU law, when we got the competence, let's say the full competence in 1999, I would say full community or union competence on immigration, the policy, at least at the time, was we have to try to tend towards approximation of rights of migrants with the rights of EU citizens. So that was the trend which we implemented with the directive. Now we may wonder if this is still the idea behind, but I mean, let's assume it still is. But which can also mean that there can be a certain differentiations because there can be certain rights linked to citizenship, for example, political rights to vote to the elections. In most cases are linked to citizenship of a member state, which is a policy choice, so legitimate in my view. But of course, when it comes to working conditions, there must be equal treatment. And there, I mean, to make the link also with what Picum said, because that if we don't, I mean, certainly this will lead to labor exploitation, to social dumping, pressure on wages. I mean, this is something that we have to fight against. And I think the first step is to effectively implement, more effectively than it was so far. I acknowledge the Employer Sanction Directive in the first place and the other instruments that we have at European level to fight labor exploitation and employment of irregular migrants, but also of regular migrants if the conditions are exploitative. So I think the first step would really be to implement that effectively and more forcefully, which is something I will bring back. It's not under my direct responsibility, but certainly is very much linked to the discussion on legal migration and integration. So that I think it must be on working conditions and on other basic rights, that must be the principle. Then it doesn't mean that we cannot differentiate also amongst categories. As I said, it does make a difference if a person has been working for 5-10 years in a member state, contribute to social security, or is staying there for 5 months in a year for certain type of benefits. I mean, so that it's a legitimate differentiation that all member states do, and that's not a scandal in itself. But of course, there must not be discrimination in implementing the rules. So that's the very minimum. But voilà.
Thank you, Minos. Can I just turn to this question about the degree to which you need targeted, specific action for these particularly vulnerable groups, refugees? You're working with them all the time, or whether you basically, if you ensure that all workers, if you get the framework right for everyone, then that is the way, regardless of their status, documented or undocumented, EU citizens or migrant workers, that is the way to approach this? Or do you feel that the specific needs of refugees require specific responses, whether they be legislative or policy or so on? How do you see, so when we talk about social inclusion, is it different when you're talking about these particular groups and therefore they need specific actions? How do you see that balance of the general and the specific?
Thanks. It's indeed a bit of a tricky debate because categorization and segmentation has inherent risks, of course. And personally, I'm no big fan of kind of boxing out specific groups of people or specific categories of immigration status or specific vulnerabilities. I absolutely echo also my previous speakers and the comments from the floor on equal treatment as the baseline, as the main principle that should not be derogated from unless there are objective and justifiable reasons for doing so. Beyond that, it goes back to how different people can access those rights. Because if there are objective difficulties, again, that lead to situations whereby a person has twice as much, let's say, difficulty accessing employment because they don't speak the language, because of disability, it could be any reason, not necessarily linked to migration status, but this could also be a ground, having, let's say, raw equality without sensitivity to those difficulties will actually lead to a situation whereby those people will de facto be excluded, even though legally they had the rights. So that brings us again to the point that the law must ensure rights for everybody on equal footing, but in practice, those special needs need to be catered for if we want everybody to effectively access those rights.
So going back to Javi's four tools he started with, yes, the legislation, and that's for all workers, but if the policies, you need the targeted policies for the different groups given their specific needs. Would that be...
That is one thing, and I think the law to some extent can also make provision for this flexibility as something that ensures higher standards and higher protection to those that need it, rather than derogating from, let's say, the universal principle for specific categories. And this is something that we already see, for instance, in the asylum acquis when it comes to accommodation needs, for instance. We acknowledge a right to accommodation and an adequate standard of living for all, but we do acknowledge that specific categories of people have additional needs or need additional attention. It's just about that.
Thank you. Before we come, and I haven't forgotten your question about access to services, we will come back to it. But just on this point of the general versus specific approaches, does anybody want to add it? Laura?
Well, I think I agree very much with Minos, because in fact, it's always a bit a dilemma. I mean, to what extent we do have target policies and investment for certain categories that can be refugees, that, as I said, there are vulnerabilities of people that have to flee war, so it's not that you can immediately go to work immediately, and then so there are some needs, also psychological support that might be needed, health. So of course, I mean, I think in some cases it has to be targeted at first, but I think that in a way, I mean, what we have perceived, and maybe one of the previous speakers can confirm this, a person that has come and has given a refugee status is a person in the first place, so he or she doesn't want to be labeled for all his life or a life as a refugee, but in the first place as a person. So in a way, once the insertion into the labor market, into society is supported, then people need to have access to mainstream services like all of us. So I think there is a transition that might be needed at first for some categories of people, and of course even more for children, I mean, that have to be brought into education and supported, of course. But
if you like, it's needs-driven rather than category of person-driven.
Yes, I mean, it can be for some categories that we need more support also in general, but I would say it's also a bit needs-driven in the first place. But then I think eventually our target has to be people are a person in the first place. They are into the society, they are workers, they have a family, and they have to use all services like all of us. So that must be the ultimate aim, I think.
Marco, I don't know whether you want to come in on this specific discussion about the general versus the specific, and also whether you, also as a trade unionist, have a concern about this word fair or not.
Yeah, the concept is fair mobility implies equal treatment. This is the concept.
Yeah. So when we use it, we know what we mean.
No. It's an issue of civilized societies. In civilized society, is fair mobility implies equal treatment. Is from the ILO concept established before the Second World War, and we have etc. And we have violated in Europe with the, for instance, with the ICT directive. Come on. Yeah. This is in the facts, in the sense that.
I will give you a chance to reply. Don't worry.
No, I mean, you know very well, for intra-corporate transfers is a big misunderstanding behind the rules applied and with the impact of the international law. And the equal treatment is absolutely the attempt to have fair mobility comes from the fact that many people say in a very liberal way, equality is impossible, is utopia, and we cannot have the ambition because we will never be all equal. Of course, from a legal point of view, it's completely a way to try to establish different rules for same people making the same job, which is, frankly speaking, and we are talking equality at the workplace. I mean, here I'm speaking about equality on the workplace. I'm doing the same job. We are doing the same thing, and we want to have the same treatment. And we know what does it mean legally. And this is, I think we should not have doubts on this. This is also in the European fundamental rights, etc. So this is given. So that is why it's not an issue of trade unions or employers. It's something that we all have to look at. So concerning the specificity, I have to say, if I have to look at what my colleagues at national level, because we are European, me as a European bureaucrat of the unions, look at what my colleagues are doing, and normally they have created specific services in order to help people to have the same access to rights, services, etc. So they have dedicated, and this proved to be successful. And if it's successful, and 7% of our members have a migration background, it means 8 million people. I think that's for us the specific, general rules, frameworks, but when you go into the ground, the fields, concrete problems, sometimes you have to look at the specificity of the problems.
Can we now pick up on this point about access to services, because it is a crucial issue, and we're focusing on the broad categories of vulnerable groups, but within the vulnerable groups, there are more vulnerable groups, and as he was saying, that ability to move and take those rights with you. Are we doing enough to address this question in terms of access to services? What can be done to ensure, what more needs to be done to ensure that these particularly vulnerable groups do have the access to services and indeed know how to access them? I'm thinking here, we talked quite a lot about the role of the social partners, but also the role of civil society in terms of helping people. Minos, perhaps a thought from you, from your very concrete experience, in terms of access to services and what we need to do to ensure they have the access and indeed they know how to go about getting it. How do we address those issues, particularly for the vulnerable within the vulnerable, as it were?
For me, that might be a bit of a tricky question in the sense that I don't have, let's say, the full picture of how that happens on the ground. On the role of civil society, I would absolutely agree that there is a crucial role in following through and walking through, let's say, a person and supporting them through the process of integration, which depends, as most civil society activities, pretty much on programs, on funding. So we need to make sure that from a policy level, there is enough planning and there is enough support for the organizations that will be able to carry out that process. Because very often, when we talk about people whose migration status is determined and then, let's say, cleared, for instance, when we talk about refugees, there is very often the simplistic assumption that as soon as a person gets status, their life is in order, everything is okay, and then they can follow on independently. Obviously, that is not what happens in reality. There needs to be a very lengthy process, even after getting the paperwork, to make sure that a person has support in that transition period that Laura mentioned, before becoming fully independent and into the regular system. One thing that you raised that is very important and very interesting, given the, let's say, transnational and EU dimension, is movement from one member state to another, to the extent that this would entail loss of status, loss of rights. And there we have a bit of a paradox in the way the EU thinks about free movement, because it is indeed one of the fundamental freedoms. It's guaranteed for EU citizens, for certain categories of third country nationals. But for others, including refugees, it's a non-starter. Only under very specific and very difficult and onerous circumstances would, for instance, a person recognized as a refugee be able to move to a different country to settle. So already you have a bit of a formal obstacle to overcome beyond the practical issue of how you would make sure that your disability, vulnerabilities are recognized automatically in the second member state.
Thank you very much. Laura, perhaps I could come to you on this, on two things, because we don't have that much time. Also want to touch on access, not just to services, but also the Commission's approach to access to social security. I don't know if you could touch on that at the same time, because we don't have that long, and a very warm welcome, Marita.
Yes, thanks. Well, it's not really my field, but I mean, I will get into that.
If you can, I don't know what, yeah.
Yes, no, on the access to the services, I mean, I think we have had, again, sorry if I quoted again, very intense discussion at the Migration Forum last week with the civil society. And certainly what emerged is that when there is a true partnership cooperation between the local authorities, the civil society, including trade unions, this is where it works, it does work, and where people are better supported to access their services. From, I think, the Commission side, the best thing we can do is really to provide funding for this to member states. I mean, we can't do it directly to local authorities except under union actions, which are very specific. But I mean, we are also encouraging member states to work more.
Can you do it to NGOs on this specific area?
Well, we have calls, limited calls. Let's say that most of our funding goes through share management, 85% to member states, and then to also local authorities. But we have also direct calls where, of course, NGOs and others can apply, and where we are funding also these kind of things. We and also DG Employment. I mean, now they have an open call on labor market integration under their fund. So we have. It is true that there has been a mainstreaming also on funding in all Commission departments. There has been a prioritization, including under the structural funds, for funding for integration of refugee and migrants, not only into the labor market. So I think that's something that, because let's be honest, we are not on the ground as Commission, so I think we have to work with the civil society, with the trade unions, to see together how to help, putting together. What we have also trying to do is really to facilitate a dialogue between the national level and the local and regional levels, which we will continue to do, because this is often an issue in some member states. If I can just reply to some questions on the mobility. I mean, no, of course, I mean, I don't disagree with Marco that the fair mobility, it's really equal treatment of working conditions. I've just said before that this has been abused in the debate on free movement. But of course, I don't disagree on the working conditions. I have to say that also in our legal migration legislation, even when we favor the mobility, intra-EU mobility of migrants, and in the blue card, the current proposal, we are doing that even more. The wage requirement is kept. So the second member states always is entitled to check the wage and the salary, just to avoid social dumping. So we have a lot of safeguards in our directives to avoid also what he mentioned about the Netherlands or other member states not respecting. So it is again a question of member states checking that, because we don't have the means, I mean, unless we get complaints or information from external stakeholders, but we are not monitoring ourselves on the ground what the employers do. How do they change the salary after admission? I mean, this is really for the member states, and they have all the tools, all the guarantees, the safeguards, both in our EU legislation, in national legislation, to do it. It's just a question of really doing it. And on the refugees, also one last thing, it is because we wanted also to favor the mobility and the labor mobility of refugees that we have integrated them into the scope of the Blue Card Directive, so they can get a blue card, those that fulfill the conditions, so it's for highly skilled refugees, and then they can be mobile and go to work in other member states and so on, which they cannot do today, I mean, under the blue card, but also, I mean, their mobility is very limited. So we hope that this remains. We count on the Parliament to keep it in.
I don't know, Marco, Javi, whether you want to talk about access to service at all. There's one other question before we draw some conclusions. I'd like to come back on the funding and investment and where we put it. But did you want to comment on the access to services question first or not? No. Okay. In terms of we've talked quite a lot about, and one of your tools was funding, but we also know that the money available at EU level is relatively small. And Laura's talked a bit about some of the ways it's being used. But for you, if we are to ensure that the European money in this equation delivers maximum bang for bucks, where do you see the EU's added value within this broader need to invest in all these areas, which we talked about in the first panel and we've talked about again here? How can EU money best be used to help address some of the issues we've been talking about?
Well, trying to have a common framework and spend the, well, I would say two things about funding, no? It's not relatively small. It's small, the resources that we have.
It's small, yeah.
It's small. It's 1% of the GDP. But at the same time, we decide the rules about the rest. Because especially like in the Eurogroup, the six-pack, the two-pack, all of these rules that we have, fiscal rules that we have for the member states, are made by the EU. Well, and then we maybe don't have a lot of resources. We have 1% only, but at the same time we decide about the rest of the resources. We can decide, okay, you have deficit limits or so on, but we will decide that, for example, all the money that you will use in immigration or integration refugees, it will be not counting to the limits of deficit. For example, Well, because sometimes when we are talking about a fiscal policy of the EU, it's true, it's a fact, we don't have a lot of resources.
So beyond the pot of money, there are ways you can open up the pots for other people.
Yeah, but at the same time, we decide all the fiscal rules.
Sure.
And then, and especially if we are in the Eurozone, the countries that we are in the Eurozone. And this,
Sure.
this is a fact. And then, well, how we can use the money of the EU, like trying to have a common framework, a common approach of rights and in the labor market. And at the same time, I will say, okay, we should use our resources to have a common projects with the member states, because this will be the best, with common policies, because this will be the best way to enforce the member states to spend money in this common framework.
Okay.
And this is my point.
Marco, where do you think the EU can add most value in terms of investing in tackling the issues we've been discussing?
No, frankly speaking, inside the EU, I think there are a lot of efforts to try to redirect resources. We have to recognize the Commission made a lot of efforts. It's maybe also up to us as social partners to offer something that could be worthy to be financed. Yeah. This is what we are trying to do. Partially, we already got it because we already have in place now a project co-financed by the DG Home. Of course, I'm not now going in the more general things of macroeconomics, etc. The only things I would say, I would not be too optimistic in the fact that the economic growth, if it will arrive or if it will change certain sentiments concerning racism, xenophobia. I think there is, I was saying, giving the example of the UK, but there are also other. I think there is something beneath our societies and our people that goes beyond the wealth and the economic advantage they have from belonging to the EU. So and maybe there, I think we can spend a bit more to try to face these sentiments that are arriving. One big concern we have, and we are saying very strongly, for the external dimension of migration, we are very concerned by the fact that the money that should be addressed as a huge heading of the European budget, development cooperation budget, ODA, so-called, can be used to stem the migration flows and to make a use that we don't have time to go on. That is not the topic of today, but for this issue, we are really concerned by the effects that this could have.
Thank you. Minos, based on your experience and working with refugees, where can EU money really make the most difference?
I think my previous speakers have covered it quite well. One thing that I would try to add is beyond thinking about how the money can be raised further, what more resources we can tap into, it's also about making sure that the existing sources are properly utilized. And we've heard a bit about how the Commission has gone about better coordination between different services and different funds in that regard, which is commendable. It's about also making sure that this happens cross-institutionally. So do the member states do the same? Do the different ministries that are responsible for the absorption of all those different funds coordinate with each other? In many cases, it's not the case. Or member states may not be aware that a particular fund that was not the AMIF fund is available for integration of migrants and refugees. I would also echo this for the Parliament. I think this goes for everybody. This is such a cross-cutting issue and a challenge, and I think beyond all the sort of negative, in my view, too, direction in which the asylum debate is going, we have managed to make sure that integration is a key priority. And to me, this is remarkable amongst the frenzy that is going on in all other areas. And every possible actor should be thinking about integration. So it's about making sure that this doesn't just happen in Brussels, it also happens on the ground.
You wanted a quick word before we draw some conclusions, Laura.
Yes, just to link up to this, I mean, no, absolutely. I think it is crucial. I mean, first of all, we have managed to increase the funds and with support also Parliament for integration. So I think most, if not all, but at least most member states realize that they have to invest in the people, they have to invest money to ensure that people that have arrived, that are here, that will stay, they are fully integrated into the society, starting with the labor market, but not only. So I think this is something that they may not all say it publicly, but they know, and they do, the member states authorities. And about the fact of using the funding, we have tried to do some pedagogy with member states, also with the funding authorities, both under our fund, Asylum, Integration and Migration, and also under the social funds, together with the colleagues of DG Employment. employment, so that the managing authorities, which sometimes they are the same, and that's the easiest, of course, if they are the same managing authorities for the social funds and AMIF, okay, that's simple, but not always. So to tell them to talk to each other and to ensure that there is also a certain consistency and synergies in the use of funds, not for the same things, for the same activities. It's, I mean, it's a difficult process, but at least we are pushing them to do so, and also to have actual partnerships, as I mentioned before, because they are obliged legally, both under the social funds and under our fund, to have a true partnership with local authorities, with the civil society in deciding the allocation of funds. But we know that this doesn't function very well in all member states. So this is another crucial point, I think, where we have to ensure that the funds go where they have to go.
Lots of crucial points. So I'm going to ask you, we are in a room of politicians, and politicians like priorities. So for each of you, and Laura, I came to you last on the first round, so I will go in reverse now. So Laura, Minos, Marco, and Javi, and then I'll give the floor to Marita to close. But if you had to identify one priority, and it can be, going back to our discussion of the general versus the specific, do you take action to protect all workers, whatever status, or do you take specific action for specifically vulnerable groups? So you can either have something very specific for migrant workers, for refugees, or it can be for all workers. If each of you had to identify one key next step to ensure we really do translate those principles, which, as you said, it can be relatively easy, it's the practice that isn't of equal treatment and rights, what would you do? What is your key priority? Laura first, Minos, Marco, Javi.
Well, I mean, I will repeat myself, I'm sorry, but I think it's really the key word is really enforcement at national level of both labor law standards in general and of migration, also law, migration and asylum, to ensure that the migrants and refugees are particularly protected, because we know they are more vulnerable to exploitation. So I think that's the key word for now. I mean, and then we'll see if we need more laws and better laws.
First, make sure you implement what you've got before you invent any more. Thank you. Minos.
I'll probably annoy you and repeat the same stuff too, but
no, listen, the point is, out of all the things we talked about, so inevitably.
I would also stress again the need to break the silo approach and to break the sort of schizophrenic approach that this union very often has to solving problems, where two different units within the same institution say completely different things. So I would say, as far as these questions are concerned, this is not just a Libe question, it's also an EMPL question, it's a question for everybody. And you have more expertise on what access to the labor market means, how those conditions need to be ensured in practice. So it's about stressing this, making sure that not only the enforcement of existing legislation, but also the design of new rules takes into account those issues. And it's not just something for interior ministries and asylum experts like myself to tell you what to do.
Thank you very much. Marco.
We said after all this complexity, we have to choose one thing.
I know. It's a very unfair question.
No, in this case, symbolically, I would like to have the blue card directive adopted soon. With no, I mean, we have to recognize that the draft was very good. There are some improvements that, especially in EMPL committee, have been they are working on. So let's make the improvements that are needed. But it would be a very nice, a good signal to have a positive act on migration.
A very concrete step in a very concrete area. Thank you, Javi. For the panel, you have the last word.
Oh, well, after we will have our
after
chair.
We'll have Marita, yes.
Yeah. Marita, well, I agree, but I would add two things. We were discussing the last weeks, months in this parliament, and we will discuss about the humanitarian visa. I think this is a key point, because obviously we are talking about the integration in the labor market, but one of the main problems that we have is we don't have a legal door to arrive to the asylum seekers. And I think this is crucial if we want to end with the problem that we have in the Mediterranean. But to add to these policies, he was explaining this during all the panel. I think it was a really, really important point. We need a narrative to all of these policies, to the blue card, humanitarian crisis, instruments, extra funding, blah, blah, blah. We need a narrative to try to explain to our public opinion that this is an interest of all of us. This is not talking about vulnerable groups. It's not talking about migrants, refugees. It's talking about what kind of society we want to have.
And on that note, ladies and gentlemen, will you join me in thanking our panel very much indeed. Thank you to you all. You can either stay, if you have to slip away, I understand, but otherwise please do stay, because it is now my pleasure to give the floor to Marita Ulvskog, MEP, who is, of course, Vice Chair of the European Parliament's Employment and Social Affairs Committee, to give us some closing thoughts. Over to you.
Thank you. It's very difficult to give closing remarks when I didn't arrive until you almost had finished the meeting. But I'm here as a member of the Employment Committee, and we are really dealing with those issues all the time. Why? Because labor migration and mobility are crucial for a well-functioning economy. That is something that we don't argue around. We just say that is a fact. And another fact is that if it comes lots of many refugees to the European Union, they lack many of them lack the capacity of language, and language could be linked to work and training, but it needs to be dealt with to allow for quicker labor market integration and also for access to training and education. And there has to be better and quicker recognition of skills, including validation of informal or non-informal skills. And it takes long to wait for documents allowing you to work in a member state, and so on. And that means that it's extremely complicated. And people are, for obvious reasons, desperate. They have to start a new life in a new place, and they must have a job so that they can have somewhere to live and perhaps live with their family. And we don't have all the tools we need. We have engagement, we have social partners, trade unions and employers who are involved and are engaged. We have governments, we have politicians, we have lots of so-called ordinary people that react as we shall react, trying to help, trying to find solutions. And that is where we start all integration also in the labor market for those coming to the European Union. Having said that, yes, to avoid social dumping and to avoid xenophobia, that's two very important points to have in mind. We have to fight against abuse we see on the labor market. We have to be careful and avoid creating a second labor market with less rights or wages, low wages for migrants. We don't want to split the labor market in one for those who will have no rights and those who have, yes, lots of rights, because we fight for that. And we can see that labor migration is feeding into the debate regarding the posting of workers and the internal debate about freedom of movement. That makes it even more difficult for the refugees, and it puts a pressure on us. We should not encourage competition of low-skilled employment. We need to encourage a sustainable labor market also in this situation. Employment is growing, but still many jobs are not ones that nationals want to have. And that splits the labor market even harder, even sharper than the situation was before the refugee crisis. We can find concrete suggestions, and we can find some results too. We can try to find a solid ground for refugees to go from. make paperwork go quicker, widen social services, invest in social policies, recognize the potential contributions of refugees and migrants, translate that into the reality on the ground, and regain the trust of the citizens in how we deal with this issue. We have to have real policies for equal treatment and rights, and a comprehensive system of social integration. It's not enough to have legislation to ensure equal rights if you can't enforce them. That is really the key. We need to have legislative standards, but it's not sufficient. We need to go beyond new legislation and not pose image that is painted by the right-wing extremists. We need a social pillar. We don't have it today. We don't know how it will be built, but that is exactly about one thing: upward social convergence. We shall not accept that we have a real poor working class that is not allowed to work, because that is what we can see. If I can speak as a moment as not just an MEP, but as a Swedish citizen. As you might know, Sweden is one of the countries that has opened up for many migrants. There are some persons who has comments on that. For example, the new US president, who is,
Indeed.
Who has given lots of stories on how Sweden is now cracking down its catastrophe and so on. Well, we are very dull people. We started to organize the society, and also lots of people who wanted to be engaged on their free time to see to that the refugees have somewhere to live, that those who are young can start learning the language in school. And the other day, early this week, the social partners made an agreement that said that those refugees who has come to Sweden, they will now have a special sort of engagement. That means that they have a work 50% of the day, 50% of the day they study language and other things they have to know to get a better job in a couple of years. So they are paid full time, but 50% of the day they study. And this is a deal between the social partners. And that means that they also split the bill for that. Had you asked someone 2 months ago, everyone has said that is not a possible solution. Now it's
shows what can
started
be done
to function. Every member state can do that, and some must have support from the EU budget to do it. But there are several member states that has this richness of new young citizens, some of them well educated, coming from other parts of the world to live here. It's actually not only a cost, it's a gift. Thank you.
And on that uplifting note, thank you, Marita. Ladies and gentlemen, will you join me in thanking Marita very much indeed? It only remains for me to thank all our speakers again this afternoon for very stimulating, very frank exchange of views, and we've covered a lot of ground. Thank you to the interpreters for doing a wonderful job. As always, thank you to the organisers for bringing us together and our host MEPs for having us. Most of all, thank you to all of you for coming. We do need to leave this room very quickly because there is another meeting in 3 minutes, but snacks and drinks are served outside. If you can stay, please do join the reception outside. But if I could ask you to leave the room and take your belongings as quickly as possible. Thank you all very much and enjoy your evening.
Likewise. Thanks very much.
It was a pleasure.
Thanks again.
Bye.
Nice seeing
Nice
you.
to see you.
Thank you very much. Thank you,
Nice
Javi.
to meet you.
It was a pleasure.
No,
Great.
no
Thank you.
problem at all.
Thank you much.
Thank you, Minos.
Thanks very much again. Excellent moderation.
Terrific. Thank you, Marita.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I was in a meeting yesterday. I was expecting great things from you. Thank you. No, I was expecting great things from you. I was in a meeting yesterday.